No, attorney. The judge asked me, his tone dripping with condescension. She cannot afford one. My brother laughed out loud, his voice echoing through the crowded courtroom. She does not even have a job. My father nodded proudly, soaking in my supposed humiliation. I did not say a single word. I simply stood up slowly, unbuttoned my oversized trench coat, and let it slide onto the back of my chair, revealing the $5,000 tailored suit underneath. Then I turned to their smug lawyer and asked a single question about his federal security clearance that made him physically choke. The entire courtroom went dead silent. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old, and my family thought I was just a broke, grieving widow they could walk all over. They had no idea they had just declared war on the CEO of the country's most ruthless cyber intelligence firm. Before I share exactly how I dismantled their lives piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach toxic family members a lesson they will never forget. It all started on the darkest day of my life. We were at my historic Atlanta home holding the repast for my late husband Malik. The house was filled with the soft hum of quiet conversations, the comforting scent of catered soul food, and the heavy, suffocating weight of grief. I stood near the entryway, clutching the tightly folded American flag they had handed me at the cemetery just hours before. I was completely numb, trying to remember how to breathe without the man who had been my anchor, my biggest supporter, and my silent business partner. That was when my older brother Andre walked up to me. He did not offer a comforting hug. He did not ask how I was holding up on this impossible day. Instead, he shoved a thick manila envelope against my chest, forcing me to take it, to keep it from hitting the floor. I opened it with trembling fingers, expecting perhaps some final paperwork from the funeral director. Instead, I pulled out a 14-day eviction notice. Pinned directly behind it was a formal lawsuit contesting Malik's estate. I stared at the harsh black ink, my brain refusing to process the words. My own brother was serving me with an eviction notice at my husband's repast. I looked up at Andre, seeking some kind of explanation, but his face was set in a hard, entitled smirk. He adjusted his expensive watch and crossed his arms, looking down at me as if I were a stranger who had overstayed her welcome. Before I could even formulate a question, my father Calvin's voice boomed across the room. He was standing by the original brick fireplace, holding a crystal glass filled with Malik's prized aged bourbon. He did not even bother to lower his voice as the guests turned to watch the spectacle. "It is time you learned how the real world works, Kendra," my father announced, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon. "You cannot hide behind Malik's money forever. Since you decided to drop out of college and play house, you have zero practical skills. You need to face reality." My stomach turned. My father had always used money as a weapon, a heavy leash to control everyone around him. Years ago, when I was 20, he abruptly cut off my college tuition simply because I refused to marry the son of his wealthy country club buddy. He forced me to drop out, hoping the financial struggle would break my spirit and bring me crawling back under his control. He had always viewed me as a failure for not finishing that degree, a massive disappointment, who just answered phones for her successful husband. "You can move into Andre's basement," my father continued, waving his glass dismissively toward me. "He is willing to let you stay there provided you pay rent on time, of course. We are family after all, and we take care of our own." The sheer audacity of his words left me breathless. I was standing in a beautifully restored home that Malik and I owned, free and clear, and my father was offering me a basement as if doing me a charitable favor. The guests shifted uncomfortably, looking down at their plates or whispering among themselves, but no one intervened. In my family, Calvin's word was absolute law, and challenging him was social suicide. Needing a moment to breathe and process the ambush, I retreated to the kitchen to carefully set down Malik's flag. But I was not alone for long. Brittany, my white sister-in-law, followed me in and cornered me by the island. She ran her hands over my imported marble countertops, offering a fake sympathetic smile that did not reach her cold eyes. "Your natural hair looks so brave and untamed today, Kendra." she murmured, reaching out as if to touch it before I quickly stepped back out of her reach. I am so sorry for your loss, but you know the Lord works in mysterious ways. She casually picked up a hors d'oeuvre, examining it critically, before putting it back down on the tray. By the way, I have already hired contractors to come in next week. We are going to completely remodel this kitchen. The dark cabinets are just a bit too heavy and urban for my taste. I stared at her, trying to process her sheer audacity. She was standing in my home eating my food, completely oblivious to the fact that Malik and I had fully paid for her and Andre's luxury destination wedding in Cabo 3 years ago, when Calvin's funds miraculously got tied up. She was eager to claim my home before my husband's grave was even settled. Then Andre walked into the kitchen, stepping directly into my personal space. He towered over me, using his physical presence to try and intimidate me exactly like he did when we were teenagers. I am going to need the keys to Malik's home office right now, Andre demanded, extending his hand palm up. I need to secure the assets before you do something stupid and mismanage them. Hand them over, Kendra. I do not have time to play games today. My heart pounded against my ribs. Malik's office was not just a regular study. It was a retrofitted soundproof and bulletproof vault where we ran our highly classified operations. Andre thought he was just going to walk in and grab bank statements and expensive watches. He had no idea what was actually behind that heavy steel door. I stepped back, squaring my shoulders. You are not going anywhere near his office, I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the shaking in my hands. This is my house, Andre. It was your husband's house, Andre sneered, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. And according to the updated will, we found you do not get to call the shots anymore. Do not make me call the police to remove you from my property. I looked down at the legal documents in my hand again, focusing on the second page where Malik's supposed updated will was attached. I scanned the text, reading the unfamiliar legal jargon that dictated Malik was leaving his entire estate to my brother to manage on behalf of the family. Then my eyes landed on the signature at the bottom of the page. I did not cry. I did not scream. All the panic and crushing grief that had been threatening to drown me suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp clarity. The signature was a forgery. It was a very decent attempt imitating the loops and slants Malik used when he signed fast, but it completely lacked the specific pressure points and the slight break in the letter K that only I knew about. It was a fake. A very deliberate, very illegal fake. I realized in that exact moment what was happening. My family was attempting to steal everything Malik and I had built, assuming I was too uneducated and too broken by grief to fight back. They thought I was just a helpless housewife who would fold under pressure and hand over the keys to her life. I looked at my brother, his hand still outstretched, waiting for the office keys. I looked out into the living room at my father sipping my dead husband's bourbon, looking incredibly pleased with his orchestrated ambush. I looked at Brittany, already mentally redecorating my kitchen. I carefully folded the eviction notice and the forged will and slid them into my black leather shoulder bag. I smoothed the front of my dress, took a deep breath, and looked Andre dead in the eye. I will not be handing over any keys today, I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of emotion. Andre's face darkened, and he opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off, holding up my hand. Enjoy the catering, Andre. Dad, make sure you finish that bourbon. It is an excellent vintage. I turned on my heel and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them standing there looking momentarily confused by my complete lack of hysterics. They thought I had surrendered. They thought my quiet departure meant they had won the first battle and that I was retreating to pack my bags. They had no idea I had just collected Exhibit A. I walked away from the living room, leaving my father and brother to their arrogant assumptions. The heels of my shoes clicked a steady rhythm against the restored dark oak floorboards of the hallway. The air inside my historic Atlanta home felt incredibly dense today. It was thick with the scent of catered Southern food, heavy floral arrangements, and the suffocating presence of relatives who had come to mourn a man they had never bothered to truly understand. I slipped the manila envelope containing the forged will and the laughable eviction notice into my leather shoulder bag. My mind was already racing, analyzing the amateur forgery of Malik's signature. I needed a moment to breathe, a moment away from the predatory eyes of Calvin and Andre. I bypassed the crowded dining room and headed straight for the kitchen, seeking the quiet sanctuary of the space Malik and I had spent months designing together. The kitchen was supposed to be empty, but as I pushed through the swinging door, I stopped dead in my tracks. Brittany was standing right in the middle of the room. My white sister-in-law was running her pale, perfectly manicured hands over the imported Calicut marble countertops of my center island. She looked up as I entered, flashing a bright, practiced smile that was entirely too enthusiastic for a repast. She was wearing a sleek black designer dress that looked much more suited for a high-society cocktail party than a gathering of mourning. "Kendra," she cooed, her voice dripping with that manufactured syrupy sweetness she always deployed right before saying something deeply insulting. "I am just so incredibly sorry for your loss. Malik was such a wonderful light in this family." She tilted her head, her eyes slowly scanning me from head to toe, before lingering deliberately on my head. "And your hair. Wearing your natural curls out like that today. It is just so brave and untamed. I could never pull off something so unbothered at a funeral." I gritted my teeth, swallowing the sharp retort that burned on my tongue. Brave and untamed. It was the exact kind of backhanded, racially coded microaggression Brittany specialized in. She had married my older brother Andre 5 years ago, and from the very first day she had made it her personal mission to establish dominance in a family she viewed as beneath her, despite my father's desperate attempts to cater to her every whim. She turned away from me and walked over to the custom espresso machine Malik had imported directly from Italy, tracing its polished chrome finish with a greedy, calculating gleam in her eyes. "You know," Brittany continued, her voice echoing in the large space, completely ignoring my stony silence. "I was just telling Andre that this kitchen has such incredibly good bones, but the dark custom cabinetry is just so heavy. It feels a bit too urban for this kind of prestigious historic neighborhood. Do you not think?" Actually, I went ahead and took the liberty of calling some contractors this morning. They are going to come by next week to give me a quote on tearing out all this marble and putting in something a little more civilized. Maybe a bright white quartz. It will really open up the space for when we host our dinner parties." I stared at her, feeling my blood run absolutely cold. She was standing in the very heart of my home, talking about gutting my kitchen, while the soil on my husband's grave was literally still fresh. She spoke with the casual authority of a woman who fully believed she was already the lady of the house. "The property taxes in this district are going to be an absolute nightmare," she sighed dramatically, waving her hand in the air as if the massive financial burden was already resting squarely on her delicate shoulders. "Andre and I are going to have to do a total budget overhaul just to manage the basic upkeep of this estate. It is going to be a sacrifice, but family legacy is so important." The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of her words almost made me laugh out loud. I looked at the expensive fabric of her dress and thought back to the reality of her financial situation. 3 years ago, when Brittany had thrown a tantrum demanding a luxury destination wedding in Cabo San Lucas, my father Calvin had proudly puffed out his chest and promised to foot the entire bill. Calvin wanted to show off for her wealthy family to prove that his golden boy son was marrying into a lifestyle they both deserved. But less than a month before the wedding, Calvin's funds miraculously got tied up in what he called a complicated real estate deal. Andre had come to Malik and me late one night, sweating and literally begging for a financial bailout so he would not look like a broke failure in front of his new bride's family. Malik, being the generous, forgiving man he was, had quietly written a certified check that covered the entire six-figure event without batting an eye. We paid for the exclusive beachfront villa. We paid for the lavish custom floral arrangements. We even paid for the very designer wedding dress she walked down the aisle in. My family had sworn Brittany to secrecy about where the money came from, allowing her to believe Calvin had simply liquidated an asset to save the day. They were oblivious hypocrites living in a fantasy world, funded by the very people they looked down upon. And now this woman was standing in the home my husband bought with his brilliant mind, complaining about the property taxes she fully intended to take over. The contractors will not be necessary, Brittany, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. You can go ahead and cancel them. She let out a high, breathy laugh, dismissing my words completely, as if I were a child who did not understand adult conversations. She turned and strolled confidently out of the kitchen, gesturing lazily for me to follow her into the main hallway. "Oh, do not you worry your head about the logistics, Kendra," she called back over her shoulder. "Andre is handling all the heavy lifting. You just focus on packing up your personal items." I know transitions like this can be so stressful, especially for someone who does not have a steady income to fall back on. I followed her out of the kitchen, my hands curling into fists at my sides. We reached the grand entryway hall where a small antique mahogany console table sat beneath a large vintage mirror. Resting on a velvet valet tray right next to the door was Malik's vintage gold watch. He had taken it off the night before he died, complaining that the heavy clasp was scratching his wrist while he typed. I had not been able to bring myself to move it since the paramedics took him away. It was sitting exactly where his strong, gentle hands had left it, a painful golden reminder of the time we had run out of. Brittany spotted the glint of the gold immediately. Her eyes widened with naked avarice, and she completely abandoned her leisurely pace, stepping quickly toward the table. "Oh, wow," she murmured, reaching her pale hand out toward the velvet tray. "This is a truly gorgeous piece. You know Andre has always admired Malik's taste in watches. I think I will just take this now for the memories. It would look so incredibly handsome on Andre when he takes over the company meetings." Her fingers brushed the cool metal of the watch band. Before she could even attempt to pick it up, I stepped forward and snatched the watch right out from under her hand. My movement was so fast, so precise, and so unexpectedly aggressive that she actually flinched, pulling her arm back against her chest, as if she had been physically burned. I closed my fist tightly around the heavy gold timepiece, feeling the cold metal press deeply into my palm, grounding me in the reality of the moment. "Do not ever touch his things," I said. My voice dropped an entire octave, carrying a deadly icy calm that finally wiped the fake performative sympathy right off her face. Brittany froze, staring at me in genuine shock for a fraction of a second before her expression hardened. The sweet, accommodating sister-in-law act vanished completely, replaced by an ugly sneer that twisted her perfectly contoured features. She looked at my clenched fist, then slowly reached up to adjust the leather strap of her expensive designer bag, the very bag my husband's hard-earned money had secretly purchased for her last Christmas. She leaned in close to me, invading my personal space until I could smell the sharp mint of her chewing gum. Her voice dropped to a harsh, venomous whisper that was meant only for my ears. "You are acting awfully bold for someone who is about to be completely homeless, Kendra," she hissed, her eyes flashing with malicious triumph. "By Monday morning, Andre and I will legally own this entire house anyway, so I really would not get too attached to that jewelry if I were you. We will be taking that too." Monday morning arrived with a heavy downpour that washed the streets of Atlanta in a cold gray light. I sat straight-backed in the plush leather chair of Abernathy Monuments, holding a glossy brochure of granite headstones. Mr. Abernathy, a kind older man with a soft voice, was explaining the difference between laser etching and traditional engraving. I selected a massive slab of absolute black granite, a dignified and unyielding stone that perfectly matched the man Malik had been. The total came to exactly $8,500. I reached into my purse and pulled out my personal platinum debit card, sliding it smoothly across the polished mahogany desk. Mr. Abernathy smiled sympathetically and processed the card through his terminal. A sharp beep broke the quiet atmosphere of the room. He frowned slightly, adjusted his reading glasses, and ran the card again. Another harsh beep. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Williams," he murmured, his voice thick with apology. "It seems the card has been declined. Would you like me to try another method?" I felt a slight prickle of confusion, but kept my expression entirely neutral. That account had well over $100,000 in liquid cash. I apologized for the inconvenience and handed him the heavy metal card linked to the primary joint account I shared with Malik. That account held over $400,000 specifically designated for immediate household and emergency expenses. Mr. Abernathy ran the heavy metal card. The machine beeped a third time, loudly declaring the transaction invalid. A cold realization began to creep up the back of my neck. I excused myself from the office and stepped out into the quiet hallway. I pulled out my phone and dialed the priority routing number for my bank. The automated system immediately flagged my profile and transferred me to a human representative. The woman on the other end sounded incredibly tense when she verified my identity. Mrs. Williams, I am looking at your profile right now, and there is a hard administrative freeze on every single account linked to your Social Security number. I asked who authorized the freeze. The representative hesitated before reading the notes attached to the file. An ex parte emergency injunction was filed at 8 o'clock this morning by an attorney named Sterling Vance. The court order claims you are a severe flight risk and pose an immediate danger of draining the estate assets. All funds have been frozen pending a full probate investigation. I thanked the representative and ended the call. Sterling Vance was Calvin's personal lawyer, a high-priced, ruthless fixer who specialized in burying people in endless legal paperwork until they submitted. I walked back into Mr. Abernathy's office, apologized for a sudden banking error, and promised to return later in the week. I felt the sympathetic and pitying eyes of the staff tracking me as I walked out into the rain. I climbed into the driver's seat of my SUV and shut the door, locking out the noise of the storm. The rain hammered against the windshield, blurring the world outside. I gripped the leather steering wheel, letting the reality of the situation wash over me. This feeling of sudden, absolute financial paralysis was not new. It was a weapon I knew intimately. I closed my eyes and was suddenly 20 years old again, standing in the vast study of my father's house. I was holding a tuition bill for my junior year of college. Calvin sat in his leather wingback chair, smoking a cigar and looking at me with absolute authority. He had just informed me that he had arranged a marriage between me and Marcus, the arrogant, lazy son of his wealthiest country club associate. The union would have secured a massive real estate merger Calvin had been eyeing for years. When I looked him in the eye and flatly refused to be sold off like a piece of corporate property, Calvin did not yell. He simply picked up his phone, made one brief call to the bank, and wiped out my entire college fund. He told me that respect was learned through starvation. He told me that until I agreed to follow his blueprint for my life, I would not receive a single dime. That was the day I packed a single duffel bag and walked out. I was forced to drop out of university, taking minimum wage shifts just to keep a roof over my head. Calvin used money as a leash to command total obedience. He enjoyed watching people squirm. He enjoyed the power of holding their survival in his hands. Sitting in my car 15 years later, I realized he thought he was playing the exact same card today. He and Andre had conspired with Sterling to cut off my financial oxygen. They expected me to panic. They expected the sudden terror of having no access to cash to break my spirit and bring me crawling back to them, begging for mercy. My cell phone vibrated violently in the cup holder. The caller ID flashed the name Sterling Vance. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear but did not say a word. Kendra Sterling's slick, oily voice oozed through the speaker. I assume you have tried to buy something today. A coffee, perhaps. A tank of gas. I am sure you have noticed the slight complication with your banking. I remained completely silent, listening to his steady breathing on the other end of the line. I am calling, as a courtesy. Sterling continued, his tone dripping with fake magnanimity. Your father and brother are very concerned about your current mental state. Grieving widows often make erratic financial decisions. We simply had to ask a judge to step in and secure the estate to prevent you from squandering the assets. The judge agreed that a college dropout with zero independent income poses a massive liability to a multi-million-dollar estate. Your accounts are locked tight, Kendra. You do not have access to a single penny. I watched the rain slide down the glass of my window, waiting for him to deliver the actual pitch. I knew Sterling never cornered prey without offering a trap disguised as a way out. However, Sterling sighed dramatically. Your family is not entirely heartless. They know you need to eat. They know you have bills. I have been authorized to offer you a lifeline. I can arrange for the court to release a $1,000 weekly allowance directly to you. It will be enough to keep you fed and housed in a modest apartment. And the catch, I asked, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of the panic he was waiting to hear. Sterling chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. Just a small administrative formality. You need to sign a quitclaim deed handing the historic Beacon Hill property over to Andre by the end of the day. Andre needs to secure the physical assets of the estate immediately. You sign the house over and you get your allowance. And if I decline, I asked. Then I will drag this probate process out for years, Sterling stated, his voice dropping its friendly facade and turning sharp and lethal. I will file motion after motion. I will bury you in discovery requests and injunctions. You have no money, Kendra. You cannot even afford to retain a lawyer to fight me. I will bleed you completely dry. You will be sleeping on the streets before this estate is settled. Sign the deed, Kendra. It is the only way you survive this. Sterling waited for my response. He was waiting for the tears. He was waiting for the frantic bargaining, the desperate pleas for mercy, the inevitable breakdown of a woman who had just lost her husband and her home in the span of a few days. I pulled the phone away from my ear, looking at the screen. I tapped the red button, disconnecting the call instantly. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, cutting off his toxic existence from my space. I did not cry. My heart rate did not even elevate. I leaned over the center console and opened the glove box, pressing a hidden latch at the very back. A small, concealed compartment clicked open. I reached inside and pulled out a secondary, heavy-duty encrypted smartphone. It looked like a thick block of black metal, completely devoid of brand markings. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner embedded in the screen. The device hummed to life, reading my fingerprint and scanning my iris simultaneously. A green light flashed, approving my identity. I swiped past the complex security protocols and opened a highly secured browser, navigating directly to a dark web financial portal that did not exist on any standard search engine. The interface loaded in stark, minimalist black and white. It required a randomized 32-character alphanumeric passcode, which I typed from memory without hesitating. The screen refreshed, displaying a routing network of anonymous offshore holding companies. I scrolled through the corporate structures, bypassing the dummy corporations, and landing on the master ledger. The total balance of the master account stared back at me in crisp white digits. Multi-millions of dollars, fully untraceable, fully liquid, and scattered across jurisdictions that Sterling Vance and his corrupt local judge could never even dream of accessing. Malik and I had spent the last decade building an empire in the shadows. The money sitting in my frozen Atlanta bank accounts was nothing more than pocket change, a deliberate decoy, designed to look like a standard successful life. I stared at the staggering wealth resting in the palm of my hand. My family thought they had successfully cut off my oxygen. They thought I was a broke, desperate widow trapped in a cage of their making. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the atmosphere. I locked the encrypted phone and slipped it into my pocket, putting the car in drive and pulling out into the rain, ready to go to work. The rain had stopped by the time I pulled my SUV into the private underground parking garage of the sleek downtown Atlanta high-rise. The building housed the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Innovations. Malik had founded Vanguard 5 years ago as a public-facing technology incubator. It was a highly successful, highly visible enterprise, and it was completely separate from our real classified work at Apex Citadel. Vanguard was the shiny, acceptable face of my husband's genius, while Apex was the hidden muscle. I took the private executive elevator up to the top floor, the heavy brushed steel doors parting smoothly to reveal the expansive glass-walled boardroom. The emergency shareholder meeting had just been called to order by the time I walked in. I took my seat quietly near the center of the long, polished mahogany table, deliberately leaving the high-backed leather CEO chair at the head of the room completely empty out of respect. The atmosphere was heavy with genuine mourning. These brilliant executives had loved my husband. They respected his vision, and by extension, they respected me. But the quiet dignity of our gathering was violently shattered less than 10 minutes later. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a loud, forceful thud that echoed sharply off the polished marble floors. Andre marched into the room first, leading the charge with a predatory swagger. He was followed closely by my father Calvin and their ruthless fixer of an attorney Sterling Vance. They moved with a synchronized, unearned arrogance, completely ignoring the stunned, outraged expressions of the board members. Sterling carried a thick vintage leather briefcase, while my father and brother wore perfectly tailored suits and expressions of absolute authority. The chief operating officer, a sharp woman named Sarah, immediately stood up, placing her hands on the table and demanding to know the meaning of this blatant intrusion. Sterling did not even blink. He simply raised a hand, silenced her with a smug look, and slapped a thick stack of legal documents onto the center of the conference table. The forged will. Sterling confidently announced to the entire room that he officially represented the Williams family estate, and that effective immediately control of Malik's 51% majority shares had been legally transferred to Andre. The collective gasp in the room was audible. The executives stared at the documents, and then looked frantically at me, their eyes wide with profound confusion. Before anyone could formulate a proper legal objection or call for security, my father stepped forward to take control of the narrative. Calvin placed both his hands flat on the polished wood of the conference table, leaning forward to address the board as if he were a seasoned king addressing his loyal subjects. He did not look at me. He purposefully spoke over me, treating me as if I were entirely invisible. He loudly declared that Vanguard Innovations was in a fragile, vulnerable state and desperately needed strong, capable leadership to guide it through this unexpected tragedy. He waved a dismissive, heavy hand in my direction, telling the entire room of highly educated, accomplished executives not to mind the grieving housewife sitting quietly among them. He actually used those exact words, projecting them across the room to maximize the humiliation. A grieving housewife. He told the board members that I was completely out of my depth, that I did not understand the first thing about venture capital, corporate structures, or high-level negotiations. He chuckled a low, patronizing, deeply offensive sound and announced to my colleagues that I had dropped out of college years ago and lacked the basic formal education to even comprehend what was happening in this room. To hear my father tell it, I had simply answered phones from Malik, managed his social calendar, and picked up his dry cleaning, while the real men handled the complex business of running an empire. He painted me as a fragile, uneducated burden who desperately needed her capable family to step in and save the company from her inevitable emotional mismanagement. He weaponized my past, using the very financial abuse he had inflicted upon me when he cut off my tuition to justify stealing my future right in front of a captive audience. The executives around the table exchanged horrified, disbelieving glances. The chief financial officer, a brilliant man who had spent countless late nights reviewing predictive algorithms with me and Malik, opened his mouth to angrily defend my credentials. I caught his eye across the table and gave a sharp, subtle shake of my head, instructing him to stand down. Let them dig their graves, I thought. Let them put every single one of their delusions on spectacular public display. Andre, sensing no immediate physical resistance from the stunned, paralyzed room, took my continued silence as absolute submission. He walked slowly around the long table, running his hand along the backs of the ergonomic chairs, until he reached the head of the table. He stopped and stared at Malik's empty chair, the seat that still held the phantom weight of my husband's brilliant presence. Without a single ounce of hesitation, without a shred of human decency or respect, Andre pulled the heavy leather chair out and sat down. He leaned back, crossing his legs, and resting his hands behind his head, surveying the room as if he had just conquered a small nation. The disrespect was so profound, so physically repulsive, that I felt a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. Andre looked down the length of the table directly at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious, triumphant joy. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white business card. He flicked his wrist with a theatrical flourish, sending the card sliding rapidly down the smooth, polished mahogany surface. It glided perfectly, coming to a halt directly in front of my folded hands. I looked down at it. It was a standard Vanguard Innovations corporate card, but Andre had already crossed out the printed executive name and scribbled my name in messy blue ink. Right below it, he had written the word receptionist in large block letters. Andre smiled a wide predatory grin showing all his teeth and told me that since I was suddenly locked out of my bank accounts, he was willing to be incredibly generous. He loudly offered me a job answering the phones for the company my husband built, stating that it was the only real manual work a college dropout was actually qualified to perform in a building like this. He told me I could start Monday morning at minimum wage, assuming I could figure out how to operate a standard multi-line phone system without breaking down in tears. The absolute silence in the boardroom was deafening. The air was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. The executives were paralyzed, caught between their profound respect for Malik's widow and the aggressive legal bluster of a man holding what appeared to be a binding federal document. Sterling Vance paced slowly behind Andre, reminding the board that resisting this transition of power would result in immediate termination and potential lawsuits for anyone who stood in the way of the new majority shareholder. My father nodded along, validating every toxic, degrading word that fell from my brother's mouth. They were putting on a masterclass in corporate intimidation, trying to steamroll a room full of seasoned professionals through sheer audacity and the brutal element of surprise. They relied entirely on the arrogant assumption that because I had no formal degree and no currently visible bank account, I had absolutely no power to fight back. They equated a piece of paper with intelligence and loud, aggressive posturing with actual strength. They had no idea that while they were busy playing corporate dress-up and running petty real estate scams, I had spent the last decade building a cybersecurity fortress that protected national secrets. They thought I was just a civilian caught in the crossfire. They did not realize they had just arrogantly kicked down the door and walked into a room with a seasoned general who was already 3 steps ahead of their entire operation. I looked at the defaced business card sitting on the table, the blue ink mocking my very existence and challenging my right to sit in that room. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand and picked it up. I traced the sharp edge of the card, feeling the heavy premium cardstock between my fingers. I looked slowly up the length of the table, meeting Andre's arrogant, mocking stare with a polite, placid, and entirely unbothered smile. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not throw the card back at his smug face. I simply folded the card neatly in half and slid it carefully into the front pocket of my tailored blazer. I told him in a voice as smooth as glass that I would keep his generous employment offer in mind. Andre smirked, leaning further back in Malik's chair, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He was completely oblivious to the steel trap that was already closing silently around him and our father. At the far end of the table, the board chairman, a distinguished silver-haired man who had been Malik's primary mentor, picked up the forged will. He read through the first page, adjusting his reading glasses as he scanned the legal phrasing. He read through the second page, staring intently at the forged signature at the bottom. The chairman slowly lowered the document, resting his hands on the table, and looked directly down the line of executives until his eyes met mine. He was silently asking for confirmation on exactly how I wanted to proceed with this charade. I held his intense gaze and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of my head, just a tiny fraction of a movement. The chairman straightened his silk tie, placed the forged document completely flat on the mahogany table, and cleared his throat loudly. The chairman of the board, Richard Thorne, leaned forward. His silver hair caught the ambient light of the boardroom as he rested his forearms against the polished mahogany table. He possessed the quiet, unshakable gravity of a man who had navigated international corporate warfare for 4 decades. He did not look at Andre. He did not look at my father. He kept his steely gaze locked directly on Sterling Vance. With a single flick of his wrist, Thorne slid the heavy parchment of the forged will back across the long expanse of the table. The paper moved with a soft, continuous hiss, stopping exactly at the edge of Sterling's leather portfolio. This document is entirely inconsequential to this board, Thorne stated. His voice was not loud, but it carried a sharp, resonant authority that commanded absolute silence. The smug, triumphant smile that had been plastered across Andre's face instantly froze. He blinked, looking down at the rejected paperwork, and then up at the chairman. My father, Calvin, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his thick fingers tightening around the arms of his chair. He was a man accustomed to blind obedience, and the chairman's flat rejection clearly short-circuited his brain. Sterling Vance, however, immediately puffed up his chest. He was a high-priced fixer, a man who made his living bullying local magistrates and steamrolling grieving families through sheer volume and aggressive legal posturing. He slammed his hand flat against the table loudly enough to make the water glasses rattle. "Excuse me," Sterling barked, his tone dripping with arrogant condescension. "I highly suggest you read that document again, Mr. Thorne. That legally binding paperwork grants my client absolute authority over the entire estate of Malik Williams. That directly includes his 51% controlling stake in Vanguard Innovations. You are looking at the new primary shareholder and the incoming CEO of this company. Refusing to honor a federal probate directive is not just a breach of corporate fiduciary duty. It is a direct violation of the law." Thorne did not flinch. He did not even blink. He looked at Sterling with the kind of exhausted, profound patience a seasoned professor might reserve for a particularly slow student. Mr. Vance Thorne replied, his voice smooth as ice. "I do not care what that piece of paper says. I do not care if it was signed by a local judge, a federal magistrate, or the President of the United States. Malik Williams' 51% controlling shares are legally and structurally non-transferable." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The executives sitting around the table remained perfectly still, their eyes darting between Thorne and the intruders. I kept my face entirely neutral, my hands folded neatly in my lap, but inside my chest, a spark of brilliant, satisfying warmth ignited. Sterling let out a harsh, mocking laugh, a sound completely devoid of actual humor. He stood up, unbuttoning his tailored suit jacket, and began to pace the length of the room, acting as if he were in a courtroom performing for a jury. "Do not play corporate games with me," Sterling warned, pointing a sharp, manicured finger at the chairman. "Under Georgia Probate Code, all assets held by the deceased immediately transfer to the executor of the estate. If you attempt to block my client from assuming his legal position, I will personally drag Vanguard Innovations through years of debilitating litigation. I will file an emergency injunction to freeze every single one of your operating accounts by the end of the business day. I will have the court appoint an external receiver to audit your financials, and I will hold every single board member in this room personally liable for defying a federal mandate. You will be tied up in depositions until this company bleeds out and files for bankruptcy." Sterling stopped pacing and crossed his arms, looking incredibly pleased with his performance. He thought he had delivered the ultimate checkmate. He thought he had terrified a room full of wealthy executives with the threat of endless public legal battles. Thorne simply sighed and adjusted his gold cufflinks. He reached into his own leather folio and extracted a single sheet of paper. He placed it carefully on the table facing Sterling. "You are entirely welcome to attempt an audit," Mr. Vance Thorne said. "But you will find that Vanguard Innovations is nothing more than a highly functioning subsidiary." Malik Williams was a brilliant visionary. He was the face of this operation, the creative mind who drove our public-facing technology incubator. But Malik did not personally own those shares. He never did. Calvin leaned forward, his face turning a deep mottled shade of red. "What are you talking about?" Calvin demanded, his loud voice breaking his previous silence. "I know for a fact my son-in-law owned this company. He built it from the ground up. He controlled the majority." "He managed the majority," Thorne corrected smoothly. "But the shares themselves are legally held by a massive anonymous parent holding group." Malik was merely the appointed proxy, the designated representative acting on their behalf. The holding group provided the initial seed money, the infrastructure, and the operational muscle that protects Vanguard from hostile takeovers. The controlling stake is locked inside an ironclad corporate trust. Upon Malik's unfortunate passing, the proxy status was immediately revoked and full control reverted automatically to the parent company. I watched Calvin's expression twist into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. My father had built his moderate wealth through local real estate and aggressive intimidation. He truly believed that business was simply about putting your name on a building and bullying people into submission. He could not comprehend the complex labyrinth of corporate shielding shell companies and offshore trusts that Malik and I had spent the last decade building. We had constructed this exact architecture specifically to protect our assets from vultures, exactly like Calvin and Andre. We knew that true power did not come from parading your wealth in public. True power came from owning the shadows. Andre, however, did not share our father's silent confusion. Andre felt the sudden terrifying realization that his guaranteed ticket to unimaginable wealth was slipping through his fingers. The fantasy of sitting in a glass corner office, commanding respect, and wielding millions of dollars was disintegrating right in front of him. His fragile, oversized ego completely shattered. Andre kicked his chair back with such violent force that it slammed into the glass wall behind him. He stood up and slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany conference table, leaning over the surface like a rabid animal. "Who owns it?" Andre screamed, his voice cracking with rage. His face was flushed dark purple, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. Thorne looked up at him, maintaining his absolute stoic composure. "I beg your pardon." "I said who owns the damn parent company?" Andre roared, spit flying from his lips as he pointed an aggressive, trembling finger at the chairman. "You think you can just hide behind some anonymous phantom shareholder to keep me out of my own brother-in-law's company? I know how these corporate games work. You are covering for someone. Give me the name of the holding group right now." "I am afraid that information is strictly confidential," Thorne replied, his voice incredibly calm, completely unaffected by Andre's physical meltdown. "The parent company operates under severe non-disclosure agreements. Their identity is not public record, and it is certainly not available to unauthorized individuals crashing a private board meeting." "Unauthorized," Andre scoffed, letting out a wild, unhinged laugh. He paced around the head of the table, kicking a leather briefcase out of his way. "You listen to me. I am the executor of this estate. I am taking over. If you refuse to give me the name of this phantom holding group, I will personally call the Securities and Exchange Commission. I will have federal agents swarming this building by tomorrow morning. I will demand a full federal forensic audit of every single shell company tied to Vanguard. I will rip this entire holding group apart piece by piece until I find out exactly who is hiding my money." The executives around the table watched my brother's spectacular public breakdown in absolute silence. They were staring at him not with fear, but with profound pity and deep professional disgust. They were looking at a bankrupt, desperate man-child throwing a violent tantrum in a room full of billionaires. Sterling stepped forward urgently, grabbing Andre's arm, trying to pull him back and quiet him down. Sterling knew that screaming threats about the Securities and Exchange Commission in a room full of heavily lawyered corporate executives was career suicide, but Andre violently shoved his lawyer away. He was completely out of control, demanding answers, demanding respect, demanding the empire he believed he was rightfully owed. Thorne did not say another word. He simply folded his hands on the table, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and waited for the screaming to stop. He refused to answer. He refused to even acknowledge the threats. I sat quietly watching my brother unravel. I looked at the defaced business card resting in my blazer pocket. I looked at my father, who was staring at the board members with a mixture of dawning horror and utter confusion, finally realizing that his aggressive tactics held absolutely no weight in this room. They had come here to humiliate me, to strip me of my dignity, and leave me begging for a minimum wage job. Instead, they had just publicly exposed themselves as desperate, uneducated frauds. The show was over. They had played their hand and hit a solid brick wall. I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed my chair back slowly. The soft scrape of the chair against the carpet seemed to cut right through the sound of Andre's heavy, angry breathing. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored skirt. I picked up my black leather shoulder bag, sliding the strap over my arm with calm, deliberate precision. I did not look at Andre. I did not look at Calvin. I did not say a single word to Sterling Vance. I simply turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. The steady, sharp click of my heels against the polished floor echoed loudly, filling the tense, silent space. As I reached the doors, I pushed them open, stepping out into the cool, quiet air of the executive hallway. I let the heavy doors swing shut behind me, sealing the chaotic screaming sound of my brother behind thick, soundproof glass. I walked toward the private elevator without looking back, leaving them trapped in a room they did not understand, fighting an invisible enemy they could never possibly defeat. The drive back from the Vanguard Innovations headquarters provided a brief, necessary pocket of silence. The heavy gray rain continued to wash over the streets of Atlanta, matching the cold, clinical precision settling over my mind. I had just walked out of a glass boardroom, leaving my father and brother choking on their own shattered egos. They had attempted a corporate coup using a forged document and blind arrogance, completely unaware that the empire they were trying to steal was fortified by an anonymous holding group I controlled. I felt a steady thrum of adrenaline in my veins. The war had officially moved from passive aggression to open hostility. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of my historic estate, fully expecting the quiet sanctuary of my home to help me plan my next strike. Instead, I found my driveway occupied. Parked carelessly across the circular brick driveway was a pristine white Mercedes SUV, a vehicle I knew intimately because Malik's money had secretly paid the lease when my brother Andre cried about keeping up appearances. Flanking the Mercedes was a sleek black sedan and a commercial utility van with a local locksmith logo plastered on the side. I parked my car and stepped out into the lingering drizzle, the cold, damp air biting at my skin. Standing on my wide, covered front porch, seeking shelter from the rain, was my sister-in-law, Brittany. She was flanked by two men. One was a thin man in a tailored suit, holding a thick leather-bound portfolio bursting with fabric swatches and paint samples. The other was a burly man in heavy work boots carrying a massive canvas tool bag that clanked with heavy metal equipment. Brittany wore a belted beige designer trench coat, her pale blonde hair shielded by a massive umbrella. She looked entirely too smug for a woman trespassing on a widow's property. I walked up the stone steps, my heels clicking sharply against the wet masonry. Brittany did not flinch. She did not offer a fake, sympathetic greeting. Instead, she reached into the deep pocket of her trench coat and pulled out a folded piece of legal paper, thrusting it directly into my personal space. "Read it fast, Kendra," she demanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. I did not take the paper. I simply lowered my eyes and read the bold print at the top of the page. It was an emergency court order signed by Judge Harrison Miller. Judge Miller was a notorious fixture at Calvin's exclusive country club. He was a corrupt golf buddy who owed my father countless favors, and he had clearly expedited this ridiculous injunction without a single ounce of due process. The document demanded that I immediately vacate the primary master suite of the property, citing the need for the executor of the estate to secure all physical premises during the active probate period. It gave Andre, and by extension, his aggressively entitled wife, the legal right to seize control of the main living quarters. "You need to pack your personal clothes and move to one of the guest rooms down the hall," Brittany instructed, waving her hand dismissively toward the front door. "Andre is the legal executor now. We need the primary suite to manage the estate transitions properly. I brought Francois here to take preliminary measurements. We have a lot of work to do." I looked at the thin man holding the portfolio. He offered a weak, apologetic smile, completely out of his depth in this family warfare. I looked at the burly locksmith who stared at his boots, clearly just wanting to do a job and leave. Finally, I looked back at Brittany. Her blue eyes were wide and defiant, practically daring me to cause a physical scene on the front porch. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to lose my temper in front of witnesses. Instead, I reached past her, unlocked the heavy oak front door, and pushed it open. I stepped inside the grand foyer, wiping my wet shoes on the mat. "If you insist on measuring my house, Brittany, You can do it out of the rain. She let out a short, triumphant huff, taking my calm demeanor as absolute surrender. She marched into my home, shaking out her umbrella and immediately motioning for the interior designer to follow her. The locksmith trailed awkwardly behind them, his heavy tool bag thudding against his leg. Brittany walked to the center of the living room, planting her hands on her hips as she surveyed the space. Her eyes roamed over the massive, vibrant canvases hanging on the walls. Malik and I were passionate collectors of contemporary black art. Our walls featured bold, abstract pieces, heavy textures, and unapologetic cultural narratives. They were expensive museum-quality works that brought life and history into the restored historic architecture of the house. Brittany wrinkled her nose, her face twisting into a mask of supreme distaste. "Take a note, Francois," she ordered, her voice echoing in the large room. "All of this ghetto abstract nonsense is going straight into the dumpster by the end of the week. The colors are entirely too loud and aggressive. It makes the space feel like a cheap urban nightclub. We are going to replace everything with civilized classical pieces, soft pastoral landscapes, muted tones. I want this entire house scrubbed clean of this aesthetic. It feels like an infestation." I stood in the archway of the foyer listening to her casually racist architectural critique. She spoke about my culture, my aesthetic, and my husband's legacy as if it were a disease she needed to bleach out of the floorboards. She viewed the very essence of who we were as something beneath her, something to be paved over with bland beige entitlement. She walked through my living room, pointing at handcrafted sculptures and imported rugs, declaring them all unfit for the high society dinners she planned to host in a house she did not even own. But her little design tour was quickly abandoned. She did not actually care about the living room art. She had a specific target in mind. Brittany abruptly turned on her heel and marched past me, heading straight down the main corridor toward the east wing of the house. "Follow me," she snapped over her shoulder, gesturing for the locksmith to hurry up. I knew exactly where she was going. The east wing held a single room, Malik's home office. It was not a standard home office with a hollow wooden door and a simple brass keyhole. Because of the highly classified nature of his work with Apex Citadel, Malik had reinforced the room. The door was solid steel painted to match the historic wood trim of the house, but heavy enough to stop a ballistic breach. It was secured by a military-grade biometric locking mechanism that required a specific sequence of fingerprint and retinal scans to access. My father and brother knew Malik kept his most sensitive physical servers, encrypted hard drives, and corporate documents inside that room. They had clearly sent Brittany to act as the battering ram. Brittany stopped in front of the heavy steel door, pointing a manicured finger at the sleek black biometric scanner mounted on the wall. "This is the one," she told the locksmith, her voice buzzing with frantic, greedy energy. My brother-in-law was extremely paranoid. "I need you to drill right through that scanner panel and bypass the locking mechanism. Do whatever you have to do to get this door open immediately." The burly locksmith dropped his heavy canvas bag onto the hardwood floor and stepped up to examine the lock. He pulled a small flashlight from his belt and shined it directly onto the scanner panel, frowning as he recognized the high-end security hardware. "Ma'am," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck, "this is a Grade 1 commercial biometric rig. A standard drill bit is going to snap in half against this casing." "I do not care if you have to break your tools," Brittany snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "I am paying you triple your standard hourly rate to open this door. Start drilling." The locksmith sighed, unzipped his bag, and pulled out a heavy-duty cordless power drill. He attached a titanium carbide drill bit and took a step toward the scanner. I stepped smoothly off the wall, moving directly into his path. I placed myself squarely between the burly locksmith and the heavy steel door, crossing my arms over my chest. "That will not be necessary," I said, my voice perfectly calm and low. "You are not drilling into this door." The locksmith immediately lowered his drill, stepping back and holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. He wanted absolutely no part of this domestic standoff. Brittany's face flushed a deep, angry red. She stepped forward, invading my personal space, until we were standing mere inches apart. The sweet floral scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. She tried to physically push her shoulder past me, attempting to physically displace me from the doorframe. I did not yield a single inch. I planted my feet firmly, dropping my center of gravity and absorbing her push like a solid stone wall. She stumbled backward slightly, her heels skidding on the polished hardwood. "You need to move, Kendra," she hissed, her eyes wide and furious. "I have a court order signed by a judge. This estate belongs to Andre now. This house is ours. You are nothing but a squatter." I looked down at her, keeping my expression entirely blank. "A piece of paper signed by a corrupt judge does not give you the right to destroy a federal security door, Brittany. You are trespassing." Brittany let out a sharp, malicious laugh. She reached into her trench coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone, holding it up between us like a weapon. The screen glowed brightly in the dim hallway. "You want to play games, Kendra?" She mocked, her thumb hovering over the keypad. "Let us play. I am going to dial 911 right now. I am going to tell the dispatcher that I came here peacefully to execute a legal court order and the unstable, aggressive widow physically attacked me. I will tell them you shoved me. I will tell them I fear for my life. The police in this neighborhood already hate responding to this house. Who do you think they are going to believe? The hysterical black woman whose husband just died, or the terrified white woman holding a valid court order?" She smirked, a deeply ugly, sinister expression of absolute racial weaponization. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew the deadly implications of calling the police to my home and feeding them a fabricated story about an aggressive black woman. She was willing to put my life in direct physical danger just to gain access to a room full of hard drives. She waited for me to panic. She waited for the fear to break my composure. She waited for me to step aside and surrender the keys to the kingdom, to avoid a violent police encounter. I looked at the phone in her hand. I looked at the triumphant, cruel smile twisting her features, and then I smiled back. It was a slow, quiet, terrifying smile. I took a deliberate step to the left, completely clearing the path to the heavy steel door. I looked past Brittany to the locksmith, who was watching the exchange with wide, horrified eyes. "Put your drill away," I told him, my voice echoing smoothly down the long corridor. "You do not need to break your tools today." I raised my left wrist, pushing back the sleeve of my blazer to expose my sleek metallic smartwatch. I tapped the dark glass screen, waking the interface. I swiped down, pulling up a hidden application disguised as a simple fitness tracker. I rapidly tapped a complex 6-digit sequence directly into the face of the watch. The hallway was completely silent for 2 long seconds. Then a loud, heavy mechanical hiss echoed from the wall. The sound of massive internal steel deadbolts retracting in perfect synchronization. The biometric scanner flashed a bright, solid green. The heavy steel door clicked loudly and popped open by an inch, breaking the airtight seal. I dropped my wrist and gestured gracefully toward the dark interior of Malik's classified home office. "Please, Brittany," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper. "Be my guest. I invite you inside." Brittany did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. The invitation was all she needed. Her face lit up with a greedy, feral hunger that completely erased her carefully cultivated high society mask. She practically shoved past me, crossing the threshold into the dimly lit, climate-controlled space of the office. She did not bother to take in the subtle hum of the encrypted servers lining the far wall or the stark, minimalist efficiency of the room. Her eyes darted immediately to the heavy mahogany filing cabinets tucked beneath the reinforced windows. She believed this was simply a rich man's study, a place hiding traditional wealth. She wanted checkbooks. She wanted passwords. She wanted account numbers she could hand over to Andre to secure their unearned empire. I stood perfectly still in the hallway, watching her invade my husband's sanctuary. She dropped her designer handbag onto Malik's pristine glass desk with a careless thud. She grabbed the handle of the top filing drawer and yanked it open, her manicured fingers aggressively clawing through impeccably organized manila folders. She was searching for the keys to a kingdom she did not understand. She tossed a stack of highly classified hardware schematics over her shoulder, as if they were worthless junk mail, allowing them to scatter across the dark slate floor. She viewed my life, my culture, and my husband's brilliant legacy as nothing more than an obstacle, a temporary infestation she intended to scrub clean and replace with her bland beige vision of civilized wealth. She had absolutely no idea what kind of room she was standing in. She saw wood paneling and leather chairs. She did not see the reality. This was not a study. It was a retrofitted, ballistic-rated panic room and a fully operational, sensitive, compartmented information facility. Malik and I had spent 8 months and over $2 million secretly gutting this entire wing of the historic house. We had stripped the plaster down to the studs and reinforced the load-bearing walls with interlocking plates of military-grade titanium. The floor contained a copper mesh grid, creating a flawless Faraday cage that blocked all unauthorized cellular and radio frequencies from entering or leaving the space. The room possessed an independent air filtration system and a dedicated subterranean power supply. We had designed this vault to withstand a coordinated armed siege by highly trained corporate mercenaries. It was entirely immune to the pathetic flailing of a spoiled, entitled woman armed with a court order from a corrupt local judge. I shifted my gaze from Brittany's manic rummaging to the 2 men standing in the hallway. Francois, the interior designer, was clutching his portfolio to his chest, his eyes wide and terrified. He possessed enough basic survival instinct to recognize the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. The burly locksmith was already moving. He had seen the thickness of the steel door frame. He had seen the locking mechanisms hidden within the jamb. He zipped his canvas toolbag in one swift motion, hoisted it onto his shoulder, and began backing away down the corridor toward the front door. He did not say a word. He simply abandoned the job entirely, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the federal-level security apparatus he had almost been tricked into vandalizing. Francois took one last look at me, swallowed hard, and practically sprinted after the locksmith. They were smart men. Brittany was not a smart woman. She yanked open the bottom drawer of the cabinet, letting out a sharp, triumphant sound as she pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. She turned toward the doorway, her face flushed with victory, holding the book up as if it were a prized trophy. Her lips moved rapidly, forming words I did not care to hear. She was likely issuing another arrogant command or delivering another racially coded insult about my impending eviction. I did not give her the satisfaction of a verbal response. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, retreating entirely into the main hallway and clearing the threshold of the vault. I raised my left wrist, bringing the illuminated face of my smartwatch up to chest level. I maintained steady, unblinking eye contact with Brittany as I tapped a single bright red icon on the digital interface. The response was instantaneous and violent. The concealed pneumatic hinges hissed with a sharp release of compressed air. The massive titanium-reinforced door swung shut with terrifying automated velocity. Brittany flinched, her eyes widening in sudden shock as the heavy steel barrier slammed into the reinforced frame. The impact produced a deep structural boom that vibrated through the floorboards of the entire house. Immediately following the impact, the magnetic deadbolts engaged. 7 distinct heavy metallic clacks echoed down the hallway as solid steel rods drove themselves deep into the impenetrable frame. The airtight seal engaged with a soft suction sound, completely isolating the interior of the room from the rest of the house. Inside the vault, the reality of the situation crashed down on Brittany. The smug, victorious smirk vanished from her face, completely wiped away by a sudden tidal wave of sheer primal panic. She dropped the leather ledger, letting it hit the floor as she lunged toward the door. She grabbed the heavy internal handle and yanked backward with all her body weight. The door did not budge a single millimeter. The magnetic seal required over 3 tons of raw force to breach. She was trapped inside an impenetrable box. Brittany slammed her fists against the polycarbonate viewing panel set into the center of the door. The glass was 3 inches thick and rated to stop armor-piercing rifle rounds. Her manicured nails scraped uselessly against the bulletproof surface. I stood in the hallway, simply watching her. Her mouth was open impossibly wide, her face contorted into an ugly red mask of absolute terror and rage. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, beating her hands against the door, demanding to be released, commanding me to open the lock. But the acoustic shielding of the panic room was flawless. The soundproofing absorbed every single decibel of her hysteria. Not a whisper of her frantic screaming breached the hallway. She looked like a muted television screen playing a silent, ridiculous horror movie. She pulled her smartphone from her trench coat pocket, her fingers trembling violently as she tried to dial 911, just as she had threatened to do earlier. She stared at her screen, frantically tapping the glass, and then looked up at me with fresh horror. The Faraday cage was doing exactly what it was designed to do. She had absolutely zero cellular service. She was cut off from the world, completely isolated in a soundproof box of her own greedy making. She slammed her open palms against the glass again, her makeup running as panic fully consumed her. I offered her a polite, pleasant smile. I gave her a small, graceful wave goodbye. Then I turned my back on the silent, frantic pounding and walked away. My heels clicked a steady, unbothered rhythm against the restored dark oak floorboards as I navigated the long hallway back toward the main living areas of the house. The historic property felt peaceful again, the toxic energy of the intruders effectively neutralized. I walked past the empty foyer, noting that the locksmith and the designer had left the front door wide open in their desperate rush to escape the premises. That detail would be incredibly useful very soon. I stepped into the expansive gourmet kitchen and walked over to the marble island. I filled the electric kettle with filtered water and pressed the switch, listening to the gentle hum as the water began to heat. I opened the custom pantry and bypassed the standard teas, reaching for a delicate chamomile blend that Malik had brought back from a specialized market in London. The scent of the dried flowers was instantly soothing, cutting through the lingering tension of the morning. I retrieved a delicate porcelain teacup and a matching saucer from the glass front cabinetry, arranging them on the marble counter with meditative precision. The kettle clicked off. I poured the steaming water over the tea leaves, watching the liquid turn a rich, warm gold. I pulled out a velvet-upholstered bar stool and sat down at the island, wrapping my hands around the warm porcelain cup. I took a slow, deep sip of the chamomile, letting the floral heat settle into my chest. The house was perfectly quiet, save for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. I closed my eyes and simply waited. I did not need to call the authorities. I did not need to report a trespassing or argue with a corrupt judge about fraudulent eviction notices. I had designed the security protocols myself. The exact second Brittany's designer heels had crossed the threshold of the vault, my smartwatch had done more than just prepare the locking mechanism. It had bypassed the standard residential alarm company and sent a direct encrypted distress signal to the local police precinct and the private federal security contractors associated with Apex Citadel. I had triggered a silent alarm for an active hostile home invasion by an unknown assailant targeting classified federal assets. I took another sip of my tea, listening intently. In the distance, rising above the steady sound of the Atlanta rain, I heard the faint approaching wail of multiple police sirens. They were coming fast, and they were coming with heavy numbers. I smiled into my teacup. Brittany wanted to call the police and play the victim. I decided to save her the trouble and give her exactly the audience she deserved. The wail of sirens quickly overpowered the steady drumming of the Atlanta rain. Through the tall windows of the living room, I watched 3 Atlanta Police Department cruisers skid onto the circular brick driveway. Their rotating blue and red lights cut through the gray afternoon, casting sharp, frantic shadows across the walls of the grand foyer. I took one final sip of my chamomile tea set, the delicate porcelain cup down on the marble island, and walked slowly toward the front door. I opened it wide, stepping back to allow 4 armed officers to hurry up the wet stone steps. Their hands hovered cautiously near their utility belts as they took in the sight of the abandoned locksmith van, the open doorway, and the utter silence of the house. I maintained my perfectly neutral posture, smoothing the front of my tailored skirt. I explained the situation with calm, clinical precision. I informed them that an unauthorized individual had forced her way into a classified, sensitive, compartmented information facility inside my home. I led them down the long corridor. Even through the titanium-reinforced door, The officers could clearly hear the faint, muffled rhythm of Brittany's fists beating against the polycarbonate glass. The lead officer requested I open the door. I raised my wrist, tapped my smartwatch, and the magnetic deadbolts disengaged with a heavy mechanical clack. Brittany practically fell out of the vault. Her beige designer trench coat was hopelessly wrinkled, and her pale blonde hair was plastered to her sweaty forehead. She took one look at the uniforms and immediately launched into a hysterical theatrical performance. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at me, screaming that I had violently assaulted her, trapped her like an animal, and tried to suffocate her. She demanded they arrest me immediately. She shoved the crinkled court order directly into the lead officer's chest, expecting her tears and her privilege to grant her immediate, unquestioned authority. The officer calmly reviewed the document and then looked past her at the destroyed mahogany filing cabinets scattered across the vault floor. He asked me for my documentation. I handed him a federal property designation form identifying the room as a secure commercial asset of Apex Citadel, legally separate from the residential estate. I pointed out that the corrupt judge's probate order only granted access to the primary living suite for an estate inventory. It explicitly did not grant a civilian the right to force entry into a federally protected digital server room. The officer's expression hardened. He turned to Brittany and calmly explained that she was in direct violation of federal trespassing laws and had committed breaking and entering. The color completely drained from her face. She blinked rapidly, entirely, unable to comprehend that her weaponized victimhood was failing. When he pulled out his cold steel handcuffs, she let out a piercing, completely unhinged shriek. She fought them. She kicked, she sobbed, and she screamed for her husband as they marched her out of my house and shoved her forcefully into the back of a rain-slicked police cruiser. The silence that settled over the estate after the cruisers pulled away was exquisite. But the peace was predictably short-lived. At 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. I did not answer. I watched the screen glow in the dark room, knowing exactly what was unfolding across town at the Fulton County Jail. Because Brittany had breached a commercial space housing classified defense contractor materials, her offense carried a mandatory federal holding period and an exorbitant cash bail requirement. Andre and Calvin were currently experiencing a catastrophic logistical nightmare. They were being forced to liquidate massive amounts of cash in the middle of the night, calling in every favor they possessed to keep Brittany from being transferred to the general population block. My phone stopped buzzing. A voicemail notification pinged. I hit speakerphone and let my father's voice fill the quiet bedroom. Calvin had completely lost his carefully curated country club composure. He was screaming. The audio clipped and distorted as he roared into the receiver, dropping his respectable patriarch mask to reveal the vicious, small-minded bully underneath. He was furious about the money. He was humiliated by his daughter-in-law sitting in a county jail cell wearing an orange jumpsuit. He called me a disgrace. He called me a sociopath. And then he reached back into the past, pulling out the exact insult he had wielded against me since I was a young woman trying to find my way. "You are nothing but an ugly college dropout, Kendra." He spat, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "You think because you married a smart rich man you are suddenly untouchable. You are nothing. You have no real education, no real class, and no real power. You always were the weak link in this family. I am going to use every single connection I have in this city to crush you. I am going to freeze your accounts, seize your assets, and throw you out into the street. I am going to leave you homeless, starving, and begging on the pavement. You will have absolutely nothing when I am done with you." The voicemail ended with the harsh, violent sound of a phone being hurled against a wall. By 9 o'clock the next morning, they deployed their next weapon. A private courier arrived at my front gate demanding a signature. He handed over a thick manila envelope bearing the embossed seal of Sterling Vance's law firm. I carried the envelope to the kitchen island, opening it with a silver letter opener. It was an emergency temporary restraining order. Sterling had worked through the night performing spectacular legal gymnastics to twist Brittany's federal arrest into an act of malicious domestic terror on my part. The filing claimed that I had lured Brittany into a confined space and triggered the lock, intentionally inflicting severe emotional distress and trauma. The bold print at the bottom of the first page outlined their ultimate goal. Sterling was petitioning the court to legally ban me from stepping foot on my own property. They were attempting to frame me as a violent physical threat to the estate executor and his traumatized wife, demanding that I be forcibly removed from the premises while the probate process played out. They wanted the house empty, they wanted the vault unguarded. They were attempting to weaponize the justice system to physically clear the board and seize the assets without interference. I poured myself a fresh cup of dark roast coffee and stared at the ridiculous restraining order. Then I picked up my phone and replayed Calvin's voicemail. I listened to it a second time, then a third. I did not focus on the insults. I ignored the slurs about my education and the aggressive threats of starvation. I stripped away the bluster and focused entirely on the raw acoustic quality of his voice. I heard the ragged, breathless edge to his screaming. I heard the slight tremor when he mentioned seizing the assets. I heard the way his voice cracked when he promised to freeze my accounts. I analyzed the speed of their escalation. In less than 48 hours, they had stormed a corporate board meeting, trespassed on a secure estate, risked federal arrest, spent an absolute fortune on overnight bail, and filed a fabricated restraining order. Wealthy men who are secure in their empires do not behave with this level of reckless, chaotic speed. They do not risk federal charges for a quick payout. They do not scramble for liquid cash at 3 a.m. to bail out a trophy wife. They do not lose their temper so completely over a single locked door. A cold, sharp realization locked into place. My family was not just acting out of standard corporate greed. They were not just trying to inflate their bank accounts with Malik's money out of sheer entitlement. They were acting out of sheer, terrified desperation. They were drowning. They needed Malik's money to survive. Someone or something was breathing down their necks, and Vanguard Innovations was supposed to be their life raft. It was finally time for me to find out exactly what kind of deep, dark hole my father and brother had dug for themselves. I did not pack a bag. I did not call a lawyer to cry about Sterling Vance and his fabricated emergency restraining order. I did not shed a single tear over my father's unhinged voicemail. I simply picked up my car keys, walked out the front door of my estate, and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. The harsh Atlanta rain had finally stopped, leaving the morning air thick with damp, heavy humidity as I slid into the driver's seat of my car. I merged onto the interstate, heading straight for the dense concrete heart of the downtown financial district. My father, Calvin, truly believed he had orchestrated the ultimate checkmate. He believed he could crush me with his country club connections, his golf course judges, and his hollow legal threats. He viewed me as a defenseless, grieving widow who would simply fold under the weight of an eviction notice. He thought the threat of leaving me homeless and starving on the pavement would force me to hand over the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire. I navigated through the congested city traffic with absolute cold precision. I pulled into the subterranean parking garage of a massive unmarked glass skyscraper. The towering building possessed no exterior signage. There were no illuminated corporate directories in the marble lobby. It was a structural ghost sitting in plain sight among the city's most powerful financial giants, deliberately designed to be entirely invisible to the general public. I parked in a reserved concrete bay and walked directly toward the private elevator banks. 2 heavily armed private security contractors stood guarding the entrance, their postures rigid and alert. They did not ask for my identification. They did not ask me to sign a visitor log or present a corporate badge. They simply snapped crisp professional nods, recognizing my face instantly, and stepped aside to let me pass. I stepped into the stainless steel carriage of the private elevator. The interior featured no buttons and no floor directory. Instead, a sleek black digital panel hummed to life on the polished metal wall. I leaned forward, aligning my right eye with the optical scanner. A soft blue beam swept across my pupil, verifying my unique retinal pattern with a sharp chirp. Next, a synthesized voice prompted me for verbal authentication. I spoke my designated clearance phrase, my voice echoing clearly in the small, enclosed chamber, measuring my exact vocal pitch and cadence. Finally, I pressed my right hand flat against the glowing tempered glass of the palm reader. The system instantly mapped my palm geometry, evaluating the specific vascular signature beneath my skin. The panel flashed a brilliant emerald green, the heavy doors sealed shut, and the elevator engaged, launching me upward at a stomach-dropping velocity. As the carriage ascended smoothly through the spine of the skyscraper, my father's ignorant voicemail echoed repeatedly in my mind. He absolutely loved calling me an ugly college dropout. He loved parading that false narrative around his wealthy friends, using my supposed failure as a cautionary tale to highlight his own patriarchal superiority. He truly believed I had cracked under the academic pressure of my sophomore year, packed my bags, and slunk away into the shadows in sheer disgrace. He had absolutely no idea that I never dropped out. I was quietly and aggressively recruited. During my second year of advanced computer science studies, my unauthorized penetration test on a highly secure municipal financial grid caught the attention of the exact right people. I was pulled out of my cramped dorm room in the dead of night and placed directly into an elite, highly classified federal cybersecurity task force. I spent the next 5 years of my life operating as a digital ghost, dismantling international financial syndicates, hunting corporate embezzlers, and exposing deeply buried offshore accounts for the government. That shadow career had given me the limitless capital, the untouchable connections, and the lethal digital expertise required to build my own private empire. The elevator doors slid open with a soft melodic chime, revealing the top 3 completely integrated floors of the skyscraper. This was not a standard corporate office filled with water coolers and motivational posters. It was a massive state-of-the-art cyber operations command center. The expansive room was bathed in the cool blue and stark white glow of hundreds of high-definition monitors. Rows of sleek black custom workstations filled the floor, occupied by some of the most brilliant, ruthless, and legally terrifying digital forensic analysts in the entire country. As I walked down the wide central aisle, the ambient, rapid-fire hum of mechanical keyboards immediately ceased. Dozens of senior analysts, network engineers, and elite threat hunters stood up from their ergonomic chairs in perfect unison. They did not speak a single word. They did not offer casual morning greetings. They simply stood in respectful, absolute silent deference as their founder and CEO walked past. My father and my brother thought Vanguard Innovations was the ultimate prize. Vanguard was merely a public-facing toy, a shiny technology incubator meant to distract the masses and generate harmless press. This room was the true source of my unimaginable wealth. This was Apex Citadel. We were the country's most secretive and devastating cyber intelligence and forensic auditing firm. We contracted exclusively with federal intelligence agencies, global banking consortiums, and shadow governments. We legally destroyed corrupt corporate empires before breakfast. Malik had been my brilliant, charismatic frontman. He was the dazzling public face, the incredibly smooth talker who handled the aggressive venture capitalists, the demanding board members, and the intrusive media, while I operated strictly in the shadows, where the real power resided. He was my silent partner, my best friend, and the only person on Earth who truly understood the lethal capability of the digital machine we had built together. When he died, the board of directors assumed they were losing their visionary. My family assumed they were swooping in to steal a vulnerable fortune. They thought they had cornered Malik's helpless, isolated widow. They had actually just declared open warfare on the ruthless architect of their impending destruction. I walked past the final row of analysts and stepped up onto the raised platform at the back of the operations floor. I approached the primary command terminal. It was a curved, imposing wall of seamless edge-to-edge glass screens displaying real-time global data streams, encrypted communication channels, and raw, fluctuating financial metrics. I sat down in the high-backed leather command chair, adjusting the height with sharp, practiced precision. I placed my hands flat on the polished carbon fiber surface of the desk, taking a long, deep breath of the cool, scrubbed air. I cracked my knuckles, the sharp, distinct pops cutting through the absolute heavy silence of the massive room. I tapped the dark glass of the main interface, bringing up the master control dashboard. The glowing prompt blinked steadily, waiting for my directive. My family wanted to steal my assets. They wanted to weaponize the legal system to ban me from my own home. They wanted to leave me begging on the street. But their incredibly sloppy, frantic timing told a completely different story. They needed Malik's money desperately, and I was finally going to find out exactly why they were bleeding. I pulled up 3 blank, highly classified digital dossiers. I typed in my brother Andre's name, linking his profile directly to his supposedly successful crumbling commercial real estate ventures. I typed in my father Calvin's name, attaching his search parameters to his personal wealth management accounts, his heavily leveraged country club assets, and his hidden shell companies. Finally, I typed in Sterling Vance, linking the corrupt lawyer's profile to his prestigious downtown law firm and his private trust accounts. I bypassed all standard preliminary searches and polite financial overviews. I did not need a gentle summary of their bank balances. I initiated a Level 4 federal forensic audit on all 3 targets simultaneously. It was the digital equivalent of a nuclear strike. The aggressive predatory algorithm would immediately tear through their banking records, offshore holdings, tax filings, hidden debts, deleted emails, and encrypted private communications. It would bypass their weak firewalls and rip their carefully constructed financial lives apart, down to the very last compromised penny. I hit the execute command and watched the massive glass screens explode with rapidly cascading lines of dense green code. The hunt had officially begun. The dense streams of green code reflected in the glass of the primary terminal began to solidify into organized, undeniable data blocks. It took exactly 8 minutes for my custom algorithms to bypass the commercial firewalls protecting Andre's holding companies. The digital barriers fell like wet paper. I did not just gain access to his public balance sheets. I penetrated the deepest, most secure nodes of his personal and professional financial architecture, stripping away the carefully constructed illusion of his life. Andre had spent his entire adult life parading around Atlanta as a real estate mogul. He wore custom Italian suits, drove pristine European sports cars, and routinely dropped thousands of dollars on VIP bottle service at exclusive downtown clubs. He was the undisputed golden son, the self-made titan my father constantly compared me to whenever he wanted to highlight my supposed academic failures. The data rolling across my primary monitor painted a profoundly pathetic picture. Andre was not a mogul. Andre was completely and utterly bankrupt. Every single one of his luxury cars, including the white Mercedes SUV currently sitting in police impound with his wife, was leased under heavily penalized predatory terms. His sprawling suburban mansion was drowning in 3 separate underwater mortgages. His checking accounts were overdrawn, and his corporate credit lines were maxed out to their absolute limits. But the most glaring red flags were the encrypted communication logs. I pulled up his incoming call data and text message history. Andre was actively dodging calls from aggressive private creditors. These were not standard banking representatives or polite collections agents. These were dangerous, unrecorded lenders who charged exorbitant underground interest rates and did not operate within the bounds of the law. Andre was drowning in toxic debt, and the water was rapidly rising above his head. I shifted my focus to the secondary screen, pulling up the internal ledgers for his primary commercial real estate development firm. I began to cross-reference his incoming capital investments with his outgoing construction expenditures. The numbers did not align. They did not even come close. Andre was not building anything. He was not developing new properties or revitalizing urban neighborhoods. For the past 5 years, the family's undisputed golden child had been running a massive, aggressively predatory Ponzi scheme. I watched the digital money trail weave through his accounts, laying out the sheer horrific scale of his deception. He was specifically targeting working-class families, local community groups, and first-time investors. He presented them with glossy brochures and smooth promises guaranteeing high yield returns on exclusive property developments that did not actually exist. He was taking the life savings of hardworking people and using those exact funds to pay off his earlier investors, skimming a massive percentage off the top to fund his lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. Millions of dollars had flowed through his accounts, completely built on a foundation of lies and ghost properties. I remembered him sitting at family dinners swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, bragging about how he was uplifting the community through real estate. He was actually cannibalizing it. A Ponzi scheme of this magnitude required a massive amount of liquid cash to maintain the illusion of success. When the new investments slowed down, the old investors inevitably started demanding their returns. Andre's accounts showed a massive catastrophic shortfall 12 months ago. He should have completely imploded. The scheme should have collapsed and the federal authorities should have swarmed his offices, but the collapse never happened. A sudden massive influx of anonymous capital had flooded his accounts, plugging the holes and keeping the predatory machine running. I highlighted the anonymous deposits and commanded the algorithm to follow the money trail upward. The forensic trace aggressively chewed through layers of dummy corporations and offshore routing numbers, peeling back the digital shielding until the true source of the capital was exposed. It was my father. Calvin was the financial savior. But Calvin did not have that kind of liquid wealth in his personal accounts. My father derived his power and social standing from his position as the primary financial trustee on the executive charity board of Atlanta's largest, most prestigious megachurch. The congregation donated millions of dollars annually to fund community outreach, international missions, and local housing initiatives. I accessed the church's internal financial servers, cross-referencing their outgoing charity disbursements with Andre's incoming deposits. The connection was flawless and deeply sickening. Calvin had been actively embezzling funds from the megachurch's charity accounts. He was laundering the stolen church donations through a complex network of fake vendor invoices and fraudulent construction contracts, funneling the money directly into Andre's failing holding companies. Calvin was systematically draining the congregation's charitable reserves to keep his golden boy out of a federal penitentiary. The righteous, morally superior patriarch, who constantly lectured me on family loyalty and ethical behavior, was a common thief using the house of God as his personal money laundering facility to prop up his son's criminal enterprise. But moving millions of stolen dollars from a high-profile megachurch into a failing real estate firm without triggering massive automated alerts from the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation required specialized legal architecture. It required someone who knew exactly how to manipulate federal banking regulations and wash the money so thoroughly that it became virtually untraceable. I cracked my neck, narrowing my eyes at the final blank dossier on my far-right monitor. I initiated the deep dive into Sterling Vance. Sterling was not just a sleazy probate lawyer who bullied grieving widows. He was their bagman. The data poured in, illuminating Sterling's true role in this unholy trinity. Sterling possessed a highly classified federal security clearance, a remnant from his early career days working in specialized government defense contracting. He had maintained that clearance using his prestigious downtown law firm as an impenetrable shield for illicit financial operations. I watched the algorithm decrypt his private trust ledgers, revealing the mechanics of his operation. Sterling was generating entirely fabricated defense consulting contracts. He was taking Calvin's stolen church funds, routing them through his law firm's escrow accounts, and washing the money internationally under the guise of classified government expenditures. Once the money was sufficiently laundered through overseas defense accounts, he wired it back into Andre's domestic ledgers as clean, legitimate corporate investments. It was a highly sophisticated, deeply illegal triangle of fraud, embezzlement, and international money laundering. But the triangle was currently collapsing. I analyzed the global timing of their transactions. The federal authorities were initiating a standard mandatory compliance audit on Sterling's defense contracts at the end of the fiscal quarter. The megachurch was simultaneously preparing for an independent third-party financial review. Andre, Calvin, and Sterling were staring down the barrel of a massive multi-million-dollar shortfall. If they did not replace the stolen church funds and balance the fake defense ledgers within the next 30 days, the entire operation would violently implode. The financial discrepancies would trigger automated federal flags. The FBI, the IRS, and the SEC would simultaneously descend on them, resulting in decades of federal prison time for all three men. The final terrifying piece of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. They did not just want Malik's company out of greed. They were not trying to steal Vanguard innovations to buy more luxury cars or throw bigger parties to inflate their massive egos. They were acting out of pure, unadulterated terror. Malik's estate was worth hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid assets and clean, highly profitable technology patents. They needed to seize Vanguard Innovations, dismantle its infrastructure, and liquidate the assets to plug their massive, gaping financial hole before the federal government noticed the money was gone. They needed my dead husband's empire to buy their freedom. The security guard's large, calloused hand hovered mere inches from the bare skin of my upper arm. The air in the ballroom felt as though it had been entirely sucked out of the room. Hundreds of Atlanta's most powerful citizens stood perfectly still, watching the confrontation with wide, unblinking eyes. The silence was absolute, broken only by Brittany's ragged, hysterical breathing as she stood behind the guard, a vicious, triumphant sneer twisting her features. Across the floor by the ice sculpture, my father Calvin and my brother Andre watched with folded arms, their matching cruel smiles communicating their absolute satisfaction. They were waiting for the physical contact, waiting for the guard to grab me and drag me backward toward the exit like a common criminal. They were waiting for me to break. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. I did not raise my voice or adopt a defensive posture. I simply shifted my gaze from the guard's approaching hand directly to his eyes. My expression remained entirely devoid of fear or intimidation. I looked at him with the cold, clinical authority of a woman who routinely dismantled international crime syndicates. "Do not touch me," I said. My voice was not loud, but the sheer absolute command in my tone cut through the silent ballroom like a freshly sharpened blade. The security guard froze. His hand halted mid-air, hovering uselessly in the space between us. His professional instincts clearly warring with Brittany's unhinged demands. He possessed enough situational awareness to recognize that the woman standing before him projecting this level of effortless, lethal authority was not a violent squatter crashing a party. Brittany let out a frustrated, furious sound, stomping her heel against the marble floor. "Grab her!" she shrieked, her voice pitching up into a grating, hysterical register. "I told you she is trespassing. She is completely insane. She assaulted me. Remove her right now." I did not even look at Brittany. I kept my eyes locked on the lead security guard, offering him a small, polite smile that did not reach my eyes. "I suggest you verify the guest registry before you make a physical mistake that will end your career in private security," I told him, my tone pleasant and conversational. "My name is Kendra Vance. I am not a guest at this gala." Brittany let out a loud, harsh bark of laughter, turning triumphantly toward the surrounding crowd. "You hear that?" she crowed, gesturing wildly. "She just admitted it. She does not even have a ticket. Get her out." The security guard looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Ma'am," he started respectfully, dropping his hand back to his side. "If you do not have an invitation, I am going to have to ask you to follow me to the lobby." "I am not a guest," I repeated smoothly, reaching into the small emerald silk clutch resting against my hip. I pulled out a heavy embossed black card bearing the gold crest of the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Alumni Foundation. I handed the card directly to the lead security guard, maintaining steady, unyielding eye contact. "I am the platinum corporate sponsor for this evening's event," I stated, my voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. My firm Apex Citadel underwrote the entire operational budget for this gala, including the open bar, the jazz band, and the security detail currently attempting to remove me. "I own the VIP table at the front of the stage." The guard stared at the heavy black card in his hand. The gold embossed lettering clearly identified me as the primary benefactor of the entire evening. The color completely drained from his face. He looked from the card up to me, his eyes wide with sudden profound panic. He realized in a fraction of a second that he had just been ordered to physically assault the woman paying his salary. He took 2 rapid steps backward, creating immediate respectful distance between us. "Ma'am, I apologize," he stammered, his professional demeanor shattering. "I had no idea. We were just responding to the complaint." Brittany snatched the card out of the guard's hand, staring at the gold lettering as if it were written in a foreign language. "This is fake," she spat aggressively, waving the card in the air. "This is a complete fabrication. She is a broke college dropout. She does not have any money. Her husband died and left her with nothing. She is lying." A new voice cut through the tension, smooth, deep, and dripping with quiet authority. "Actually, Mrs. Vance, the lady is telling the exact verifiable truth." The crowd parted again as a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and an impeccably tailored gray suit walked into the clearing. It was Marcus Sterling, the managing director of the HBCU Alumni Foundation, and one of the most respected philanthropic figures in the entire state of Georgia. He walked directly toward me, bypassing Brittany completely, and offered me a warm, respectful bow. "Kendra," he said, his voice projecting easily to the surrounding crowd, "we are incredibly honored to have you here tonight. Apex Citadel's $2 million endowment to our scholarship fund was the largest single donation in the foundation's history. We were entirely unsure if you would be joining us given your recent tragic loss, but your presence here elevates the entire evening." The collective gasp that rippled through the ballroom was audible. $2 million. The whisper spread like wildfire through the crowd, leaping from politician to judge, from corporate wife to bank executive. The narrative my family had spent the entire week carefully constructing, the lie about the broke, depressed widow, was instantly and publicly incinerated. Brittany stood frozen, clutching the black sponsor card, her mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. The hysterical rage had completely vanished, replaced by a sudden suffocating blanket of public humiliation. She looked around the circle of onlookers, seeing the judgment and the quiet disgust registering on the faces of the socialites she had been trying to impress just moments before. She looked small, foolish, and entirely outclassed. I turned my attention away from Brittany, dismissing her existence entirely, and looked past the crowd directly toward the ice sculpture. My father and my brother were no longer smiling. Calvin's face was an ashen, sickly shade of gray. The Cuban cigar hung limply from his fingers, the ash falling unnoticed onto his expensive tuxedo shoes. Andre looked as though he had been physically struck in the chest. He was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, his hand gripping his whiskey glass so tightly his knuckles were turning white. They had just heard the managing director of the foundation confirm that I was the founder of Apex Citadel. They had just heard the name of the company they believed was a harmless public toy. They realized in that exact terrifying moment that I was not a weak, grieving widow. I was not a college dropout. I was the architect of the digital machine that held their entire fraudulent empire in its crosshairs. I held my father's gaze across the ballroom, offering him a slow, deliberately cruel smile. I raised my hand, giving him a small, graceful wave. Calvin swallowed hard, swaying slightly on his feet. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had threatened to leave me homeless and starving on the pavement. He had promised to use his connections to crush me. He had declared war on a ghost. I turned back to Marcus Sterling, offering the managing director a gracious smile. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice smooth and polite. "It is a pleasure to be here. Malik always believed in supporting the next generation of excellence. I am simply continuing his legacy." I turned my gaze back to the lead security guard, who was still standing rigidly nearby, looking deeply uncomfortable. "I believe this woman is highly intoxicated and causing an unnecessary public disturbance," I told the guard, gesturing vaguely toward Brittany's frozen form. "She has already spent one night in the Fulton County Jail this week for aggressive trespassing. It would be a shame for her to ruin such a beautiful evening for the rest of your guests. I think it is time for her to leave." The security guard did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He nodded sharply, stepping firmly toward Brittany. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping into a hard, no-nonsense register. I am going to need you to come with me. Brittany snapped out of her paralyzed state. She looked wildly toward my father and brother, silently begging them to intervene to save her from the ultimate social disgrace. But Calvin and Andre were completely paralyzed. They were drowning in the sudden, terrifying realization of their impending destruction. They did not move a single muscle. The two security guards took Brittany by the arms, firmly guiding her backward through the crowd. She did not scream this time. She did not fight them. She simply kept her head down, her face burning with tears of absolute humiliation as she was escorted out of the ballroom and into the Atlanta night. The jazz band smoothly resumed playing, cutting through the lingering tension in the room. The crowd slowly returned to their conversations, though the whispers about the $2 million donation and the spectacular public removal of Calvin's daughter-in-law continued to echo through the space. I smoothed the front of my emerald gown, entirely unbothered by the dramatic spectacle. The evening had only just begun. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and began walking deliberately across the floor directly toward the ice sculpture. It was time to have a private conversation with my family. It was time to let them know exactly what the algorithm had found. The grand ballroom of the historically Black college alumni gala was a masterclass in Southern high society opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung suspended from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm, glittering light over the sea of attendees. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated silently, carrying silver trays laden with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A 12-piece jazz band occupied the elevated stage in the corner, filling the massive space with a smooth, sophisticated rhythm that dictated the tempo of the evening. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, imported florals, and the quiet hum of immense concentrated wealth. I navigated the crowded floor with slow, deliberate precision. My custom-tailored emerald silk gown moved fluidly around me, the rich jewel tone catching the light with every step I took. The deep green fabric draped flawlessly, complementing the sharp, confident lines of my posture. I did not rush. I allowed the crowd to part naturally before me. The whispers that had ignited upon my arrival continued to ripple outward, moving from table to table, as the elite attendees recognized the woman who had just publicly humiliated the Vanguard Innovations estate executor and single-handedly underwrote the entire evening. My target was located at the far end of the room. A massive, intricate ice sculpture of the Foundation's crest stood as the centerpiece of the ultra-exclusive VIP enclave. This inner sanctum was cordoned off from the general admission floor by heavy crimson velvet ropes and guarded by a secondary detail of private security. Inside that roped-off perimeter, my father Calvin and my brother Andre were desperately attempting to salvage their evening. They were surrounded by a tight circle of state senators, appellate court judges, and prominent regional real estate developers. Calvin was holding court, puffing his chest out and gesturing broadly with his free hand. He was undoubtedly weaving a fabricated narrative about his expanding commercial empire and loudly bragging about his upcoming real estate acquisitions. He was using the phantom wealth of Andre's collapsing Ponzi scheme to secure political capital and inflate his own social standing. I approached the crimson boundary line. A broad-shouldered security guard stationed precisely at the center of the velvet rope immediately squared his stance. He was not the guard who had escorted Brittany out of the building. He was a fresh face strictly instructed to keep the perimeter secure for the heavy hitters mingling inside. He took a proactive step forward, moving to intercept me before I could reach the brass stanchion. His large, calloused hand lifted, hovering mere inches from the bare skin of my upper arm, preparing to physically block my path and redirect me back to the general admission floor. He clearly believed I was simply an overeager attendee trying to crash the political networking circle. I did not break my stride. Before his fingers could make contact with my skin, I smoothly raised my left hand, lifting my emerald silk clutch to chest level. I reached inside and extracted a solid, heavy rectangular card. It was not a paper ticket. It was not a laminated lanyard or a standard digital pass. I held up the solid brushed metal platinum VIP donor badge. The thick metallic surface caught the chandelier light, illuminating the deeply engraved crest, and the bold, authoritative lettering that designated the absolute highest tier of sponsorship for the entire university network. The security guard's eyes dropped to the heavy metal object in my hand. He recognized the specific weight and design of the badge instantly. The color drained from his face as the realization struck him. He dropped his hand immediately as if he had almost touched a live electrical wire. "Ma'am, I am so incredibly sorry." He stammered, his voice thick with a profound, frantic apology. "Please excuse me. I did not realize." "Right this way, ma'am." He practically scrambled backward, unhooking the heavy brass clip of the velvet rope with trembling fingers and bowing his head respectfully to grant me immediate, unobstructed access to the inner circle. I stepped past the boundary line, maintaining my effortless, unbothered posture. 10 feet away, Calvin's loud, boastful monologue abruptly died in his throat. He had been watching my approach, anticipating the moment the guard would reject me. He had been waiting to witness my public embarrassment, waiting to see the broke, depressed widow turned away from his exclusive networking circle. His smug, condescending smile vanished completely from his face. Calvin was a frequent presence on the gala circuit, but he was strictly a mid-tier donor. He donated $50,000 annually, funneling the stolen megachurch charity money through his accounts just to secure a decent table and maintain his illusion of philanthropic generosity. Because of his extensive experience navigating these high society events, he knew the foundation's financial hierarchy intimately. He knew the exact, intricate details of the donor tiers. He stared at the solid metal badge resting in my hand, his eyes locked onto the brushed steel surface, processing the undeniable reality of what it represented. He knew that the foundation did not hand out solid metal badges for $50,000 donations. He knew that securing that specific platinum tier required an initial endowment in the millions. I watched his mind frantically attempt to reconcile the conflicting data. The entire week he had been feeding the community the narrative that I was a helpless, vulnerable liability. He had believed his own lies. Now, standing in the center of the most prestigious gala in the state, he realized he had fundamentally and catastrophically miscalculated my net worth. The woman he had threatened to leave starving on the pavement was possessing liquid capital that dwarfed his entire fraudulent operation. Andre stood beside him, shifting his weight nervously. He lacked our father's comprehensive understanding of the foundation's mechanics, but the sudden absolute terror radiating from Calvin's rigid posture was impossible to ignore. The golden child was sweating profusely inside his tailored jacket, his breathing shallow and rapid. I did not acknowledge the state senators. I did not greet the appellate judges. I bypassed the circle of powerful men entirely and walked straight up to my father. I stepped directly into his personal space, violating his comfort zone and forcing him to remain perfectly still. I stood close enough to register the rapid, frantic pulse beating against the collar of his crisp, white dress shirt. The sharp, pungent scent of his cheap, overpowering cologne hit my senses, attempting to mask the sour, metallic odor of pure, unadulterated fear radiating from his pores. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to generate a theatrical display to command the space. True, absolute power operates in total silence. I leaned forward, tilting my head slightly, bringing my lips mere inches from his ear. I opened my mouth and began to speak. I did not hurl insults. I did not mention his cruel voicemails or his fabricated eviction notices. I simply and smoothly recited a sequence of numbers. I whispered the exact 9-digit routing number of his illegal offshore account. I followed it immediately with the specific 14-digit account number housed deep within a highly restricted banking institution in the Cayman Islands. I spoke the precise balance of the stolen megachurch funds currently sitting in the account down to the very last decimal point. The numbers registered in Calvin's brain like physical sniper rounds. I felt the exact moment his central nervous system completely failed. Calvin gasped. It was a harsh, ragged, desperate intake of air as his lungs completely seized. The blood rushed from his head, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. His eyes widened to impossible proportions, staring blankly ahead as his entire reality violently imploded. The muscles in his right hand spasmed violently and went completely numb. The heavy crystal tumbler slipped seamlessly from his paralyzed fingers. He dropped his $200 glass of imported scotch. The tumbler plummeted toward the ground. It struck the pristine imported marble floor with a sharp, deafening crash. The heavy crystal shattered, instantly exploding outward in a violent shower of jagged shards and amber liquid. The loud, violent noise cut through the sophisticated jazz music, drawing the immediate shocked attention of every single politician, judge, and executive standing in the VIP enclave. They turned in unison, staring at the respected church elder, standing frozen in a puddle of expensive liquor and broken glass. I did not flinch at the shattering sound. I did not step backward to avoid the splashing liquid. I remained perfectly calm, perfectly composed, and perfectly in control. I slowly raised my right hand, extending my fingers toward his chest. I smoothly and meticulously adjusted the lapel of his expensive tuxedo jacket, brushing away a non-existent speck of dust from the dark wool fabric. I smoothed the material with the gentle, careful precision of a devoted daughter tending to her father. I tilted my head, looking up into his wide, terrified eyes. I offered him a sweet, radiant smile. "See you in probate court on Thursday, Dad," I whispered. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse swung open with a deep, resonant groan, groaning under the weight of decades of legal maneuvering and quiet corruption. It was Thursday morning. The air outside was already baking the Atlanta pavement, but the interior of the courthouse was aggressively air-conditioned, chilled to a frigid clinical temperature. I walked down the long marble corridor, my footsteps entirely muffled by the thick rubber soles of the heavy, unassuming, oversized beige trench coat I was wearing. The coat was bulky and deliberately shapeless, swallowing my frame completely and making me appear frail, isolated, and small. I kept my hands buried deep in the pockets, my head bowed slightly, playing the exact role they expected of me. I pushed through the swinging wooden gate and entered probate courtroom 4B. The room was absolutely packed. Every single pew in the sprawling gallery was filled to capacity. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral perfumes and the quiet, eager murmurs of Atlanta's high society. Calvin had not just brought his legal team. He had brought an audience. He had filled the benches with his most influential friends, his country club sycophants, and the wealthiest, most prominent members of his mega-church congregation. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder, dressed in their Sunday best, whispering behind manicured hands. They had been invited to witness a slaughter. Calvin had orchestrated this entire morning as a public execution, a grand theatrical display to completely humiliate me and solidify his narrative as the righteous suffering patriarch stepping in to save his deceased son-in-law's estate from a greedy, unstable widow. I walked slowly down the center aisle, ignoring the stinging stares and the barely concealed whispers of the congregation. I approached the defendant's table. It was entirely empty. There were no stacks of legal briefs, no paralegals whispering strategy, and no high-priced defense attorneys waiting to greet me. I pulled out the heavy wooden chair and sat down alone, wrapping the bulky trench coat tighter around my shoulders. Across the aisle at the plaintiff's table, the atmosphere was entirely different. It looked like a victory celebration before the battle had even begun. Andre was seated dead center, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable arrogance. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal gray suit with a subtle pinstripe, his posture relaxed and expansive. He was leaning back in his chair, laughing quietly at a joke whispered by Sterling Vance, who sat beside him organizing a stack of fraudulent probate petitions with meticulous, smug precision. Andre looked like a man who had already cashed the check. He believed the millions of dollars from Malik's estate were only minutes away from saving him from federal prison. Directly behind Andre, sitting in the first row of the gallery, was Brittany. She had recovered from her humiliating public ejection at the HBCU gala and had returned to her default state of staggering entitlement. She was not even pretending to pay attention to the legal proceedings. She had her smartphone propped up on her designer handbag, literally scrolling through Zillow and luxury contracting websites. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers swipe across her screen, openly looking for kitchen remodelers and high-end landscape architects for my house. She was already mentally gutting my home, picking out imported marble countertops and tearing up the garden Malik and I had planted together. They were entirely, fundamentally confident in their absolute victory. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff stood up, his voice booming across the packed room, commanding everyone to rise. The judge took the bench. It was the exact same corrupt local magistrate who had blindly signed Brittany's fraudulent emergency eviction order earlier in the week. He was an older man with a florid face, thinning white hair, and the distinct comfortable posture of a man who regularly enjoyed expensive scotch on Calvin's private golf course. He settled into his high-backed leather chair, adjusting his heavy black robes with a practiced, authoritative flourish. He did not look at the plaintiff's table. He did not look at the gallery. He turned his gaze directly down at me. He looked at the empty chairs surrounding me. He looked at the oversized, frumpy trench coat hiding my posture. He looked at a woman who appeared entirely defeated, isolated, and utterly defenseless against the legal machine poised to crush her. A small, cruel smile played at the corner of his mouth. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a sharp, cracking bang that echoed off the mahogany-paneled walls, demanding absolute silence from the eager gallery. He leaned forward, bringing his mouth close to the microphone. "No attorney, Mrs. Williams?" he asked. He intentionally used my maiden name, weaponizing it as a petty calculated sign of disrespect. He was completely ignoring my legal marital status, deliberately attempting to erase my identity as Malik's wife right out of the gate. His voice dripped with thick, dripping condescension meant to echo through the sound system and humiliate me in front of the entire megachurch congregation. Andre's reaction was immediate and entirely unfiltered. He threw his head back and laughed out loud. It was a booming, arrogant sound that bounced violently off the high acoustic ceiling of the courtroom. The raw cruelty of the sound caused several of the church members in the gallery to shift uncomfortably, but Andre did not care. He was basking in the absolute power of the moment. "She cannot afford one, Your Honor." Andre mocked, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood of the plaintiff's table, grinning maliciously. "She doesn't even have a job. She is an unemployed college dropout. She has absolutely nothing." From the front row of the gallery, Calvin nodded in slow, profound agreement. I could feel the heavy weight of my father's gaze burning into the back of my neck. He was soaking in the moment, savoring the public destruction he had orchestrated. He was finally putting his rebellious, ungrateful daughter back in her proper place. He believed he had successfully stripped away all my defenses, exposing me as the helpless failure he had always claimed I was. I did not break my posture. I did not flinch at the booming laughter or the cruel insult. I sat in absolute perfect stillness, letting the silence stretch out, letting the smug satisfaction settle deep into the bones of every single person actively rooting for my downfall. Then I placed my hands flat on the wooden table and stood up. I moved slowly with deliberate, predatory grace. I did not speak immediately. I let the entire courtroom wait. I reached up and grasped the top button of the oversized beige trench coat. I unfastened it with a sharp metallic click. I moved down to the second button, then the third. The rustling of the heavy fabric was the only sound in the dead quiet room. I gripped the lapels of the bulky coat, sliding it smoothly off my shoulders. I let the heavy fabric drop entirely, abandoning it to fall over the back of the wooden chair with a soft, heavy thud. The collective sharp intake of breath from the gallery was instantaneous. Underneath the hideous beige disguise, I was not wearing the wrinkled clothes of a depressed, grieving widow. I was wearing a razor-sharp, pristine, custom-tailored black suit. The fabric was spun from the finest Italian wool, cutting a flawless, commanding silhouette that radiated absolute corporate authority. I was wearing a crisp white silk blouse buttoned precisely to the collarbone. But it was not the $5,000 bespoke suit that caused the smug, arrogant laughter to die instantly in Andre's throat. It was not the flawless tailoring that made the corrupt judge suddenly grip the edges of his bench with white knuckles. It was the heavy, solid gold crest pinned perfectly to my left lapel. The intricate metallic emblem caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courtroom, throwing a blinding, authoritative flash across the room. It was not a corporate badge. It was not a private security pin. It was the absolute, undeniable seal of a federal inspector general. It was the highest level of forensic cybersecurity authority granted by the United States government. It was the digital equivalent of a loaded weapon. The color vanished completely from Andre's face, leaving him a sickening shade of chalky white. The confident, mocking grin melted off his features, replaced instantly by a mask of sheer primal terror. Sterling Vance dropped his very expensive fountain pen, letting it clatter loudly against the mahogany table. In the gallery, I heard the unmistakable sound of Calvin choking on a sudden, desperate breath of air. They realized in a single terrifying heartbeat that they had not trapped a helpless college dropout in a vulnerable legal corner. They had actively lured a federal apex predator directly into a room filled with their financial records. The entire courtroom went dead, absolutely silent. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse swung open with a deep, resonant groan, groaning under the weight of decades of legal maneuvering and quiet corruption. It was Thursday morning. The air outside was already baking the Atlanta pavement, but the interior of the courthouse was aggressively air-conditioned, chilled to a frigid clinical temperature. I walked down the long marble corridor, my footsteps entirely muffled by the thick rubber soles of the heavy, unassuming, oversized beige trench coat I was wearing. The coat was bulky and deliberately shapeless, swallowing my frame completely and making me appear frail, isolated, and small. I kept my hands buried deep in the pockets, my head bowed slightly, playing the exact role they expected of me. I pushed through the swinging wooden gate and entered probate courtroom 4B. The room was absolutely packed. Every single pew in the sprawling gallery was filled to capacity. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral perfumes and the quiet, eager murmurs of Atlanta's high society. Calvin had not just brought his legal team, he had brought an audience. He had filled the benches with his most influential friends, his country club sycophants, and the wealthiest, most prominent members of his mega-church congregation. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder, dressed in their Sunday best, whispering behind manicured hands. They had been invited to witness a slaughter. Calvin had orchestrated this entire morning as a public execution, a grand theatrical display to completely humiliate me and solidify his narrative as the righteous suffering patriarch stepping in to save his deceased son-in-law's estate from a greedy, unstable widow. I walked slowly down the center aisle, ignoring the stinging stares and the barely concealed whispers of the congregation. I approached the defendant's table. It was entirely empty. There were no stacks of legal briefs, no paralegals whispering strategy, and no high-priced defense attorneys waiting to greet me. I pulled out the heavy wooden chair and sat down alone, wrapping the bulky trench coat tighter around my shoulders. Across the aisle at the plaintiff's table, the atmosphere was entirely different. It looked like a victory celebration before the battle had even begun. Andre was seated dead center, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable arrogance. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal gray suit with a subtle pinstripe, his posture relaxed and expansive. He was leaning back in his chair, laughing quietly at a joke whispered by Sterling Vance, who sat beside him organizing a stack of fraudulent probate petitions with meticulous, smug precision. Andre looked like a man who had already cashed the check. He believed the millions of dollars from Malik's estate were only minutes away from saving him from federal prison. Directly behind Andre, sitting in the first row of the gallery, was Brittany. She had recovered from her humiliating public ejection at the HBCU gala and had returned to her default state of staggering entitlement. She was not even pretending to pay attention to the legal proceedings. She had her smartphone propped up on her designer handbag, literally scrolling through Zillow and luxury contracting websites. I watched her perfectly manicured finger swipe across her screen, openly looking for kitchen remodelers and high-end landscape architects for my house. She was already mentally gutting my home, picking out imported marble countertops and tearing up the garden Malik and I had planted together. They were entirely fundamentally confident in their absolute victory. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff stood up, his voice booming across the packed room, commanding everyone to rise. The judge took the bench. It was the exact same corrupt local magistrate who had blindly signed Brittany's fraudulent emergency eviction order earlier in the week. He was an older man with a florid face, thinning white hair, and the distinct, comfortable posture of a man who regularly enjoyed expensive scotch on Calvin's private golf course. He settled into his high-backed leather chair, adjusting his heavy black robes with a practiced, authoritative flourish. He did not look at the plaintiff's table. He did not look at the gallery. He turned his gaze directly down at me. He looked at the empty chairs surrounding me. He looked at the oversized, frumpy trench coat hiding my posture. He looked at a woman who appeared entirely defeated, isolated, and utterly defenseless against the legal machine poised to crush her. A small, cruel smile played at the corner of his mouth. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a sharp, cracking bang that echoed off the mahogany-paneled walls, demanding absolute silence from the eager gallery. He leaned forward, bringing his mouth close to the microphone. "No attorney, Mrs. Williams?" he asked. He intentionally used my maiden name, weaponizing it as a petty, calculated sign of disrespect. He was completely ignoring my legal marital status, deliberately attempting to erase my identity as Malik's wife right out of the gate. His voice dripped with thick, dripping condescension, meant to echo through the sound system and humiliate me in front of the entire megachurch congregation. Andre's reaction was immediate and entirely unfiltered. He threw his head back and laughed out loud. It was a booming, arrogant sound that bounced violently off the high acoustic ceiling of the courtroom. The raw cruelty of the sound caused several of the church members in the gallery to shift uncomfortably, but Andre did not care. He was basking in the absolute power of the moment. "She cannot afford one, Your Honor." Andre mocked, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood of the plaintiff's table, grinning maliciously. "She doesn't even have a job. She is an unemployed college dropout. She has absolutely nothing." From the front row of the gallery, Calvin nodded in slow, profound agreement. I could feel the heavy weight of my father's gaze burning into the back of my neck. He was soaking in the moment, savoring the public destruction he had orchestrated. He was finally putting his rebellious, ungrateful daughter back in her proper place. He believed he had successfully stripped away all my defenses, exposing me as the helpless failure he had always claimed I was. I did not break my posture. I did not flinch at the booming laughter or the cruel insult. I sat in absolute perfect stillness, letting the silence stretch out, letting the smug satisfaction settle deep into the bones of every single person actively rooting for my downfall. Then I placed my hands flat on the wooden table and stood up. I moved slowly with deliberate predatory grace. I did not speak immediately. I let the entire courtroom wait. I reached up and grasped the top button of the oversized beige trench coat. I unfastened it with a sharp metallic click. I moved down to the second button, then the third. The rustling of the heavy fabric was the only sound in the dead quiet room. I gripped the lapels of the bulky coat, sliding it smoothly off my shoulders. I let the heavy fabric drop entirely, abandoning it to fall over the back of the wooden chair with a soft, heavy thud. The collective sharp intake of breath from the gallery was instantaneous. Underneath the hideous beige disguise, I was not wearing the wrinkled clothes of a depressed, grieving widow. I was wearing a razor-sharp, pristine, custom-tailored black suit. The fabric was spun from the finest Italian wool, cutting a flawless, commanding silhouette that radiated absolute corporate authority. I was wearing a crisp white silk blouse buttoned precisely to the collarbone. But it was not the $5,000 bespoke suit that caused the smug, arrogant laughter to die instantly in Andre's throat. It was not the flawless tailoring that made the corrupt judge suddenly grip the edges of his bench with white knuckles. It was the heavy, solid gold crest pinned perfectly to my left lapel. The intricate metallic emblem caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courtroom, throwing a blinding, authoritative flash across the room. It was not a corporate badge. It was not a private security pin. It was the absolute, undeniable seal of a federal inspector general. It was the highest level of forensic cybersecurity authority granted by the United States government. It was the digital equivalent of a loaded weapon. The color vanished completely from Andre's face, leaving him a sickening shade of chalky white. The confident, mocking grin melted off his features, replaced instantly by a mask of sheer primal terror. Sterling Vance dropped his very expensive fountain pen, letting it clatter loudly against the mahogany table. In the gallery, I heard the unmistakable sound of Calvin choking on a sudden, desperate breath of air. They realized in a single terrifying heartbeat that they had not trapped a helpless college dropout in a vulnerable legal corner. They had actively lured a federal apex predator directly into a room filled with their financial records. The entire courtroom went dead, absolutely silent. The silence in probate courtroom 4B was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet that pressed against the eardrums of every single person in the gallery. The smug, triumphant grins of my father's country club sycophants had been wiped away, replaced by wide, unblinking stares of total incomprehension. The solid gold crest of a federal inspector general pinned perfectly to my tailored lapel caught the harsh fluorescent light, broadcasting an undeniable truth that completely shattered their reality. The corrupt magistrate sitting high on his bench opened his mouth to speak. His florid face had drained of all color, leaving him a pale, sickly white. He raised his heavy wooden gavel, but his hand was trembling so violently he could not bring it down. He looked at the gold crest, and then looked at Calvin, silently asking for an explanation that did not exist. I did not acknowledge the judge. I did not spare a single glance for my father or my brother. I turned away from the defendant's table and walked with slow, deliberate precision straight toward the plaintiff's side. My tailored suit moved flawlessly as I crossed the floor. Every eye in the courtroom tracked my movement. I stopped directly in front of Sterling. The sleek, high-priced attorney was frozen in his expensive leather chair. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed. He was staring at the gold crest on my lapel with the terrified, paralyzing realization of a man who suddenly understands he has walked into a lethal trap. I reached inside the inner pocket of my jacket. I did not pull out a legal brief or a desperate plea for a settlement. I extracted a thick, heavy dossier bound in dark leather. Across the front cover, bright red federal classification stamps warned of highly restricted intelligence. I raised the dossier and dropped it onto the polished mahogany desk directly on top of Sterling's fraudulent probate petitions. The heavy thud of the dossier hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Before we proceed with the execution of this obviously forged will," I said, my voice ringing off the mahogany walls with crisp, absolute authority, "I have a single question for opposing counsel. Mr. Sterling, who specifically signed and authorized your top-secret federal security clearance for the lucrative defense contracts you currently represent." Sterling flinched violently at the question. His eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for an escape route that was rapidly closing. He adjusted his silk tie with a shaking hand, desperately trying to maintain his professional composure in front of his wealthy clients. "That is entirely irrelevant to these probate proceedings," he scoffed, his voice tight and unnaturally high. "But for the record, my clearance was authorized and signed by the regional director of Apex Citadel." I maintained steady, unyielding eye contact. I reached back into my pocket and pulled out my solid biometric federal ID badge. I raised it high enough for the entire courtroom to witness the holographic federal seals before I slammed it face up onto the wood right next to the classified dossier. "I am the director of Apex Citadel," I stated, my voice cutting through the air like a precision blade. "And as of 8 o'clock this morning, your federal security clearance is permanently revoked for international wire fraud, embezzlement, and severe violations of the Patriot Act." Sterling let out a strangled, horrific sound. He literally choked, clutching his chest with both hands, as his respiratory system failed him. His face turned a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. He slumped backward in his chair, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. He understood the exact devastating implications of my words. He knew the digital forensic algorithms had bypassed his firewalls. He knew his offshore laundering architecture had been completely dismantled. The corrupt judge finally found his voice. He banged his gavel against the sounding block in a frantic, chaotic rhythm. "Order!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "I demand order in this courtroom. Mrs. Williams, you are entirely out of line. I will have you held in contempt." I did not look at the judge. I simply snapped my fingers. The large armed bailiff standing near the jury box immediately stepped forward. I picked up the classified dossier and handed it directly to him. "Deliver this to the bench," I commanded. The bailiff took the dossier and handed it up to the judge. The magistrate snatched the file, ripping it open with frantic, desperate movements. His eyes scanned the first page, and his jaw physically dropped. He stopped banging his gavel dead in its tracks. The false authority vanished from his posture, replaced by raw survival instinct. He realized in a fraction of a second that if he interfered with these specific federal documents, his own long history of taking bribes and signing fake eviction orders would be placed directly under the microscope of a federal inspector general. He slowly lowered his gavel, sliding back in his leather chair and sealing his lips tightly shut. "The documents you are currently reviewing, Your Honor, are certified arrest warrants signed by the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," I announced, projecting my voice to reach the very back row of the gallery. "They outline multiple federal indictments for Andre and Sterling. Additionally, you will find comprehensive asset seizure authorizations for every single holding company, dummy corporation, and offshore account linked to Calvin." As I spoke those exact words, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with coordinated tactical force. 12 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical vests bearing the FBI insignia poured into the room. They moved with silent, lethal efficiency, securing all exits and marching directly down the center aisle. The gallery erupted into absolute pandemonium. Calvin's influential friends and church members began scrambling backward, tripping over the wooden pews in a desperate, frantic attempt to distance themselves from the imploding criminal enterprise. Andre, the golden child, the untouchable real estate mogul, completely shattered. The bespoke charcoal suit suddenly looked entirely absurd on a man weeping uncontrollably. As two federal agents hauled him roughly out of his chair, pulling his arms behind his back to secure the steel handcuffs, Andre burst into loud, pathetic tears. "Dad, fix this!" Andre sobbed, his voice echoing with absolute terror. "Dad, please, do something. Tell them they have the wrong guy." But Calvin could not fix anything. My father remained completely paralyzed in the front row of the gallery. He did not move to help his favorite son. He was staring blindly at the secondary stack of financial documents a federal agent had just dropped onto his lap. The papers outlined his total, complete bankruptcy. The millions of stolen megachurch dollars had been seized. His mortgages were called in. His credit lines were frozen. The righteous, morally superior patriarch was reduced to an empty, hollow shell staring blankly ahead as his entire world burned to ashes. Behind the plaintiff's table, Brittany was experiencing her own frantic, desperate revelation. She looked at Andre in handcuffs. She looked at the federal agents. She looked at the asset seizure documents. She realized with brutal clarity that the luxury cars, the suburban mansion, and the VIP bottle service were gone forever. She scrambled out of her seat, practically sprinting away from her husband. She shoved past a federal agent moving wildly toward me. "I had nothing to do with this," Brittany cried out, her voice shrill and panicked. "Kendra, please, you have to believe me. I did not know what they were doing. I want a divorce. I am filing for divorce today." "Look here," she shrieked, shoving her expensive designer handbag frantically toward my chest. "Take this. It is authentic leather. Take it as an apology. We can be friends. I will testify against them." I looked at the woman who had spent the entire week mocking my grief, parading around in my clothes, and trying to steal my home. I looked at the pathetic designer bag trembling in her hands. I did not offer her a single word of response. I did not accept her ridiculous peace offering. I simply stepped past her, leaving her standing alone in the center of the chaotic courtroom, surrounded by federal agents and the shattered ruins of her stolen lifestyle. I walked smoothly down the center aisle, pushing through the swinging wooden doors and stepping out into the bright, baking heat of the Atlanta morning. The drive back to Beacon Hill was peaceful. The radio was turned off, leaving only the quiet, steady hum of the engine. When I finally pulled into the driveway of the historic home Malik and I had restored together, the afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the pristine manicured lawn. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside. The house was exactly as it should be. It was silent, safe, and secure. I walked directly into Malik's study, running my fingers lightly over the polished surface of his antique mahogany desk. I opened the lower cabinet and withdrew a bottle of his favorite rare bourbon. I poured a single generous measure into a heavy crystal glass. I walked out through the French doors and stepped onto the flagstone patio overlooking our beautiful garden. The vibrant roses and hydrangeas we had planted together were in full glorious bloom. The air smelled of jasmine and warm earth. I stood at the edge of the patio, feeling the solid, unyielding foundation of the life I had built. I raised the crystal glass high, pointing it toward the clear blue sky. The empire is safe, and the trash took itself out. I drank the bourbon, feeling the warm, familiar burn settle deep into my chest. The war was officially over. I was finally home. The profound lesson from this story is that true power operates in absolute silence. You do not need to scream to be heard, nor do you need validation from a toxic family that only views you as an asset to be exploited. Kendra proved that your worth is never defined by those who belittle you. Real strength is carefully built in the shadows, fueled by pure focus and unyielding preparation. Sometimes the most empowering choice you can make is walking away from their table entirely and building your own empire. If you loved this story, please like, subscribe, and share.